Chapter 36. Yang Fan was shocked. He opened his eyes wide and said, "There's such a thing?" Ma Chiao nodded lightly and said, "That's right. The Prime Minister's doorstep is a 7th-ranked official. Moreover, she is Princess Taiping's wet nurse. Because of this relationship, very few people dare to offend her. Therefore, Mo Basho advised Su Fangzheng not to cause trouble." Yang Fan frowned and said that Madame Yao shouldn't interfere. Think about it. If the one surnamed Lu breaks off the engagement, won't he be able to wholeheartedly attend to her? Ma Chiao laughed coldly and said, "Even if the one surnamed Lu gets married, won't that Madame Yao still be able to summon him whenever she wants to? Will Madame Yao be jealous of him? Besides, she only treats the one surnamed Lu as a plaything. It's not like she's marrying him. That day I humiliated her ruthlessly. That woman has a vicious heart. She can't wait to humiliate Xiao Ning." Yang Fan was silent for a moment. He slowly said, "If that's the case, it's my fault. If I hadn't offended them that day, perhaps Sister Ning wouldn't have met with so much trouble after breaking off the engagement." Ma Chiao said, "Forget it. Let's not talk about this. You sincerely treat Xiao Ning as an elder sister. That's why you're willing to stand up for her. Even if you didn't humiliate them that day with their despicable nature, how could they easily let Xiao Ning go?" Ma Chiao was silent for a moment, then said, "Shopkeeper Su is quite loyal. Although he knew that Madame Yao has such a status, he still wanted to give it a try. So he strongly invited Shopkeeper Mo to come forward and persuade Lu Junfan. He even agreed on behalf of Xiao Ning that as long as Lu Junfan was willing to break off the engagement, he would give him some money. He originally thought that this person was too spineless, so if he was given some money, perhaps he would agree. Who would have thought that Madame Yao was at the Lu residence at that time? She actually walked out of the inner chamber and shamelessly ridiculed him, saying that a pasta soup seller's money was nothing in her eyes. She also said that Xiao Ning was going to marry that man surnamed Lu. She asked Su Fangzheng not to waste his time and come back to tell Xiao Ning to prepare to be a bride. When Yang Fan heard this, a fierce look flashed across his eyes. Even though Ma Chiao was merely relaying these words, he could imagine how condescending Madame Yao must have been at that time and how much hatred she must have harbored for elder sister Ning. This woman was narrow-minded and vengeful. That Lu Junfan was despicable, shameless, and without any backbone. With these two people together, if Pasta really married into the Lu family, he wouldn't just be unable to raise his head, he would be living a life worse than death. Yang Fan's hand pressed heavily on the couch. Suddenly, he touched a corner of the bundle. His heart was moved. Ning Jiejia's family's little bit of money is nothing in their eyes. If I use the precious jewels that Anu gifted me, can I buy Ning Jiejia's freedom? With just a thought, Yang Fan dispelled this idea. Now that this matter was hindered by Madame Yao, even if Lu Junfan was willing, she would not. He was only a shopkeeper, and Ning Jiejia was only a pasta seller. If they suddenly took out this much treasure, Madame Yao would only need to send a name card to the authorities and say that they were suspected of theft. Then it would become a big problem. Besides, that Lu Junfan was a profit-seeking fellow. Although his character was despicable, he was not an idiot. If someone was willing to take out this much treasure to buy Ning Jiejia's freedom, there was no guarantee that he wouldn't be blinded by greed. If he got an inch, he would take a foot, trying to squeeze even more wealth out of Ning Jiejia. Ma Chiao saw him lowering his head in contemplation, his expression uncertain. He knew that Yang Fan was thinking of a way to help Jiang Suning. He heavily patted his shoulder and said, "Xiao Fan, don't worry. I have already thought of a way." Yang Fan suddenly raised his head and happily said, "You have a way?" Ma Chiao nodded and said, As soon as I left Su Fangzheng's house, I started to think of a way. That man with the surname Lu doesn't have any redeeming qualities. If she marries him, Xiao Ning's life will be ruined. She grew up with me, so no matter what, I can't just watch her jump into a fire pit. I thought about it. Yang Fan suddenly understood and said, "So that's how it is. You want to elope with Ning Jejia? This is indeed a good way to take drastic measures. Huh. Ma Qiao's jaw almost dislocated. He stuttered, "This is a good way." Yang Fan beamed with joy and said, "Of course it is a good way. I have long seen that Ning Jejia treats you differently. I think she also likes you in her heart. Since you have this idea today, it couldn't be better. The two of you elope and become real husband and wife. That man, surnamed Lu, won't be able to stay." The corner of Ma Qiao's mouth suddenly twitched. He said, "Brother, although Xiao Ning hasn't married yet, the marriage contract has already been signed. In other words, she is someone else's wife. Elope? Only you can think of that. That is against the law. Even if I elope with her, we have already had 7 or 8 children. She should still be someone else's wife unless he is willing to divorce her. Besides, she has an old mother. I also have an old mother. Tell me, where can we escape to with our families?" Yang Fan then realized that he had thought wrongly. He couldn't help but ask, "Then what's the good way you mentioned?" Ma Qiao said fiercely, "Break off the marriage? That's the only way to do it. Tomorrow I will go to his house and recognize Xiao Ning's mother as my godmother. I will go there as Xiao Ning's brother and break one of his legs. I'm not afraid that he won't report me to the authorities. As long as he takes the initiative to report me, I can ask Xiao Ning to break off the engagement." Yang Fan stared at him and said, "This is the good idea you came up with? Do you know that you will go to jail for injuring someone's life?" Ma Qiao said with a serious face, "I know. That's why I came to find you. If I hit him too lightly, it won't work. No matter what, I have to break one of his legs to fulfill the condition of break off the marriage. In this way, I will naturally have to go to jail for 2 years. I have many brothers in the Ma family, so I don't have to worry about no one taking care of Mother. It's just that my cousins don't live in this house, and Mother won't leave this house to live with my brothers. When I'm not here, I hope you can take care of her." As Ma Qiao said this, he stood up and solemnly bowed to Yang Fan. Ma Qiao had many shortcomings, but he was extremely benevolent and filial to his parents. To his friends, he was supremely righteous. He was just an ordinary man in the marketplace, but who said that to be chivalrous and to die for justice, one must have extraordinary abilities. Those with great skills may not have such a chivalrous heart. Most chivalrous people are like dogs. Ma Qiao was illiterate and didn't know any great principles, but many people who knew great principles would feel inferior in front of his actions. How could Yang Fan let him stand up for himself? He immediately retorted, "Fool! Even if you go to jail, will you be sentenced? If this matter was only between Sister Ning and that Lu Junfan, it would actually be easier to handle. But now, isn't Madame Yao involved? Think about it. As long as she sends a name card to the magistrate's office, do you think the magistrate's sentence will be as you wish?" Ma Qiao was stunned for a moment and anxiously said, "Then what should we do? Don't tell me we can only watch as little Ning jumps into the fire pit? No matter what, I have to try." Yang Fan asked, "Does Sister Ning know the news?" Ma Qiao shook his head and said, "Not yet. Su Fangzheng came back late, so I have been guarding his house. After asking about the news, I came to you. I even specially told him not to tell little Ning." Yang Fan nodded his head and said, "Good. You go back first. Let me think about it tonight. Maybe I can think of a better way. If it really doesn't work, there's no harm in trying your method again." Ma Qiao smiled bitterly and said, "I, Ma Qiao, grew up in Luoyang, and I can't even do anything when encountering this kind of ruffian. If I give you one night, what good idea can you come up with?" Then I'll go back first. Don't forget what I entrusted you. If I am arrested and sent to jail, I want you to spend more effort on my mother." Ma Qiao nagged as he was sent out by Yang Fan. Tin Ano stood in the room, watching Yang Fan return. She asked, "Why did he look for you?" When Yang Fan raised his head, a murderous aura had completely hidden in the depths of his eyes. He smiled lightly and said, It's nothing, just a trivial matter. I won't be on duty tomorrow. Early in the morning, I'll send you off." In the dark of the night, the sound of the clapper came from afar, and then from near to far. Yong Fan opened his eyes. The moonlight shone through the window, and the sparse shadows on the window lattice made it look especially tranquil. He began to prepare. Opening the chest, he took out a knife from the bottom of the chest and gently inserted it into his belt. He didn't even put on his night clothes. Tonight was not the night he snuck into the Ministry of War to look through the files and broke into the Liu family. Killing Liu Junfan would be as easy as killing a chicken's ear. There was no need to act as if he was facing a formidable enemy. Yong Fan finished packing and was about to leave. His body had just moved when he suddenly stopped, his hand already gripping the hilt of the knife. The door to the rear courtyard opened and clear light poured in, casting a shadow on the ground like a sparse shadow on the window, exquisite and protruding. Yong Fan let out a breath and loosened his grip on the knife. Tin Ano slowly walked in. Tin Ano stood with her back to the light, so the expression on her face couldn't be seen. The clear and cold moonlight shone from behind, accentuating her slender waist. Her figure was extremely beautiful, and there was an indescribable elegance and beauty about her. "You're going to play cards again?" "Ah, yes, playing cards." "Do you need a knife to play cards? You're going to kill someone? Kill that guy surnamed Liu?" Chapter 37. Yong Fan did not speak. Tin Ano sighed lightly and said, "I have really underestimated you, two little thieves. One is willing to go to jail for his childhood playmate, and the other is willing to kill for her. There are indeed many loyal people in the marketplace." Yong Fan could no longer conceal it and sighed lightly. "Ah, Nu, go back and sleep. You will leave early tomorrow morning. You don't have to care about my matters." "I don't want to care, but I can't watch my savior walk into a dead end." "Can you really succeed in killing someone in the middle of the night with your lousy stealing skills? Is there no other way?" Yong Fan smiled and said, "Maybe there is, but I can't think of it." Pausing for a while, he continued, "If I have no other choice, I don't want to kill. Actually, I wanted to use the jewelry you gave me to exchange for Sister Ning's freedom." Tin Ano tilted his body slightly and looked at Yong Fan with some surprise. The value of those jewelry. A commoner like Yong Fan might not be able to accurately estimate its value, but as a little thief, he could more or less guess its approximate value. Such a fortune. He could actually give it up so easily for a woman who was neither his relative nor his lover? Tin Ano slightly raised her eyebrows and said, "These jewelry that I gave you, although it is not extremely valuable, it is enough to let you escape from poverty and enter a well-off family. You can marry a satisfactory wife and live a rich life without worrying about food and clothing. You are willing to give it away just like that?" Yong Fan indifferently said, "Anu, perhaps mediocre commoners who are busy making a living are like ants in the eyes of heroes like you who can come and go freely. But this doesn't mean that we don't value friendship and do not know loyalty. In my heart, a pearl is not more precious than a smile from a friend or a relative." Tin Ano's eyes became even brighter as he asked, "Then, why did you change your mind?" Yong Fan said, "Because Madame Yao is interfering in this matter. If this guy surnamed Liu had ambition and ability, he wouldn't have fallen to such a state. He couldn't carry anything on his shoulders, nor could he lift anything with his hands. It would be difficult for him to make a living with this amount of money. But how long could this money last? To him, Madame Yao was a mountain of gold that he could use whenever he wanted. Although this scoundrel had no backbone to speak of, he was not stupid or ignorant. If he were to tempt him with benefits, he might instead feel that he was a rare commodity and would be even more unwilling to let go. Moreover, with Madame Yao stirring up trouble, this method won't work. So you want to kill him? Kill him. Since he's no longer around, the marriage will naturally be dissolved." Tin Ano smiled and said, "That's right, but is it really as simple as you think? You also know Madame Yao's identity. Now that you have gone to her house twice to break off the engagement, Lu refused, and he died. What would Madame Yao think? If she informed the authorities, who do you think the authorities would investigate? Yang Fan clenched his teeth and said, then, I will kill her as well. Tin Ano shook his head lightly. You have gone to her house twice in a row to argue for separation. Apart from Lu, is Madame Yao the only one who knows? Since Madame Yao has this kind of identity, if her mother runs to Princess Taiping's residence and cries, even if the authorities do not look at the monk's face, they will still make a big move. You want to help that Miss Xiaoning, but in the end you will harm her. Yang Fan was startled. He really did not think that doing this would have such a troublesome ending. Tin Ano gazed at him and slowly said, to kill, you must take advantage of the moment when the person you want to kill is most relaxed. When you make your move, you must find his weakness. Only then can you succeed in one strike. Dealing with a person is the same. You must also find his weakness. It is easy for you to kill Lu, but you cannot avoid the many troubles that will follow. That Lu is extremely greedy. If you want him to change his mind, you must start with the word wealth. You originally planned to use those jewels. This idea is not wrong. It is just that you used the wrong method. Directly bribing him will not work. Yang Fan's eyes brightened. He blurted out, could it be you have a brilliant plan? Tin Ano said, first light the lamp, okay? The lamp was lit and the room was dim. Half of Tin Ano's face was reflected in the light, sparkling like egg white. A few strands of beautiful hair gently hung on her cheeks. Her evening makeup was slightly messy, and she seemed to have a few more traces of charm than her usual cold demeanor. Her eyes were as bright as the stars in the sky. But looking at the stars, one would not feel the same as looking at her eyes. She was originally a little beauty that could move one's heart. Looking at a beauty under the moonlight added 3 points of color. Looking at a beauty under the lamp and looking at a beauty under the moonlight. They are different approaches, but achieve the same result. However, the moon is cold while the lamp is warm. So when the same beauty is seen in the eyes, there is a completely different scenery. Under the moonlight, there is a poetic and picturesque feeling, making people appreciate it more. But under the lamp, it is easy to give birth to the feeling of love and possession. Yang Fan stared at Tin Ano with a very fervent gaze, but it has nothing to do with the feelings between a man and a woman. Seeing his impatient look, Tin Ano could only get straight to the point and said, the problem now is that scoundrel is greedy for money. But compared to Madame Yao, who has an inexhaustible supply of money, although your money can move his heart, he may not be willing to offend Madame Yao. And because of Madame Yao's special status, it is not appropriate for you to use force. Yang Fan impatiently said, does Anu have a good plan? Tin Ano rolled his eyes at him and said, if there is a woman who is richer, more powerful, and more beautiful than Madame Yao who favors that scoundrel, and is even willing to marry him, do you think he will be impatient to separate from your sister Ning and not hesitate to offend Madame Yao? Yang Fan said dispiritedly, you also said that he is a scoundrel. Where can I find such a blind lady from a noble family to be willing to marry him? Tin Ano fiercely glared at him and said resentfully, really an idiot. Since you are willing to use the jewelry that I gave you to exchange for Jiang Sining's freedom, can't you use it to create a rich young lady? Yang Fan's eyes lit up and he said cheerfully, I understand what you mean. Not bad. This idea seems feasible. Let me think about it. Yang Fan lowered his head and pondered for a moment before he slowly said, it is easy to use this money to create a rich young lady, but it is difficult to find this person who will pretend to be a rich young lady. Think about it. Which ordinary girl would be willing to show her face in public to accompany me to pretend to be a swindler? Besides, those pretty daughters from humble families, even if they are willing to help, they will inevitably be a little petty. How can they pretend to be a noble young lady? That surnamed Lu may be a despicable and dirty scoundrel, but he is not a person who is ignorant. With just a little contact with this kind of girl, how can she deceive him? If we hire a prostitute from a brothel, it is possible to pretend to be a rich young lady. But with their coquettish behavior, how can they be like a noble young lady? Moreover, this kind of person is not reliable and cannot be used. Speaking to this point, Yang Fan looked at Tin Ano opposite him. His eyes lit up, and he said fervently, "This is a good idea, but we need a suitable person to implement it. Anu, please lend a helping hand." Tin Ano was annoyed and amused at the same time. He said angrily, "I was originally helping you to come up with the idea. Why did you put the idea on me instead? I am leaving early tomorrow morning." Yang Fan rubbed his hands and said, "Before I leave, I will do this good deed. Anu, you are also a girl. You should understand that this matter concerns a girl's lifelong happiness. I believe you also can't bear to watch her jump into the fire pit." Tin Ano pondered for a moment before he nodded and said, "Fine, then I will help you one more time. After this matter, I have repaid your kindness." Yang Fan stood up and said with a deep bow, "Anu is righteous. I thank you on behalf of Sister Ning here." Tin Ano snorted coldly, "Don't talk about these useless things. Let's discuss what to do." The two of them sat opposite each other and whispered to each other. When it was almost midnight, Tin Ano covered his mouth and yawned. "It's done. We will start tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, you go and appease that Miss Ma. Tell her to calm down so as not to spoil our plan." Yang Fan said, "Okay, but—" Tin Ano glanced at him and asked, "What are you worried about?" Yang Fan hesitated for a moment before he said worriedly, "I suddenly thought of a serious problem." "What problem?" "Do you know how to seduce people?" Tin Ano stared at him with his almond-shaped eyes. Yang Fan quickly explained, "Don't be angry. This is a serious matter. I have to be careful. I am worried. Can you make him take the bait?" Tin Ano said angrily, "Why can't I?" Yang Fan muttered, "Look at your creditor's face," Tin Ano faintly said. "Just him. Is there a need to seduce him?" Yang Fan was startled. He clapped his hands and said with a smile, "That's right. This friend only recognizes money. As long as gold and silver can pave the way, even if it's a female yiksha, he will definitely be willing. I have worried too much." Tin Ano's pair of eyes turned into a murderous sword again as he stared fiercely at Yang Fan. Yang Fan felt that something was wrong. He quickly lay down on the bed and said, "Sleep, sleep. We still have to wake up early tomorrow." He waved his sleeve and extinguished the candles. Tin Ano snorted coldly and turned around to walk out. When she opened the back door, the moonlight as clear as water shone on her face. Her face suddenly bloomed into a smile. Her smile was very reserved. First, her red lips were slightly pursed. The smile was like the ripples of a lake. Gradually, it covered her entire face, reaching the tip of her eyebrows and the corner of her eyes. In this quiet night, that smile was just like an epiphyllum at noon, gracefully blooming. Chapter 38. Surrounded by green mountains, the three rivers ripple with white waves. The spring wind does not know the meaning of prosperity and death. The color of grass fills the old city year after year. Smoke worries and rain howls Huasheng. The palace is the old imperial city. If you ask about ancient and modern matters, please only look at Luoyang. To know the rise and fall of Luoyang, you must look at Dingding Street. At this time, Dingding Street was extremely bustling. The flat, dark green stone slabs formed a wide, flat surface, allowing one's field of vision to pour out like water. In the distance, black eaves, giant red pillars, and yellow city walls formed a simple and refined, solemn and magnificent picture. That was the lofty and proud Dingding Gate. Tall piers, 3 doorways, east and west flying corridors, east and west gates, and left and right horse paths were all connected together by a curved flying corridor. Entering this solemn and imposing Dingding Gate, one would be greeted by a street that was 150 meters wide and 4 kilometers long. Dingding Street. The perfectly straight Dingding Street was like a sharp sword, the tip of the sword pointing outwards, pointing straight at the Dragon Gate. The 4-kilometer-long Ding Ding Street was like a straight sword edge, extending all the way to the imperial city. The sword edge was the heavenly gate of the imperial palace. The sword hilt was the bright hall, heaven, and other huge palaces standing on the central axis of the imperial city. In the bright hall, there was an incomparably huge wooden Buddha statue, gilded with gold and adorned with jade, magnificent beyond compare. The Buddha pinched his fingers, and even that slightly tilted little finger was enough to hold more than 10 strong men standing on it. This huge statue was modeled after the appearance of the current dynasty's Empress Wu, with a benevolent smile on its face, overlooking the multitude of people walking into Ding Ding Street from Ding Ding Gate. The incomparably imposing Ding Ding Gate and this wide and flat Ding Ding Street were built in the Sui Day period. Sui Yang Emperor Yangguang was the first emperor to pass through this gate. Now the Sui dynasty was no more, but this magnificent building, built with the concentration of countless manpower and material resources, still displayed its function. Peddlers and pawns, scholars, merchants, endless streams of people, carriages, horses, mules, donkeys, camels from the western region, together formed this bustling and prosperous scene. If you lowered your head and looked at the hard bluestone ground, you would find many shallow footprints on it because of the long period of friction and pressure. Can you imagine that after just a few months of marriage, he would leave his hometown to do business in a foreign land? Once he left, he would not return home for decades. When his son grew up and met him in a foreign land, they actually did not know each other before they told each other their names. In this era, there was such a story. Can you imagine a person following a small merchant to do business, not taking a single cent, supporting and protecting him wholeheartedly for decades, until the small merchant became a big merchant that could rival a country, and then, according to the agreement, a part of the family property was given to him. From then on, he went from a penniless person to a rich merchant, continuing the life path of his former master? In this era, there was such a story. Can you imagine this kind of agreement without any official contract? That successful and famous rich merchant would never break the contract and owe him wages, and he would never be tempted by benefits halfway and betray the master he followed? This agreement that lasted for decades was actually all based on the word trust. In this era, there was such a story. Can you imagine a penniless seller carrying a precious ancestral gem, priced at 1 million, peddling it on the street, but no one showed interest in it, and then suddenly a knowledgeable person saw it and flew into a rage, saying that the seller was tarnishing such a precious treasure with such a low price, forcing the seller to raise the price to 10 million before he was willing to buy it? In this era, there was such a story. This was an era full of miracles. The legend of generals, the legend of politicians, the legend of rangers, the legend of poets, the legend of women, all of the above belonged to the legends of the merchants of the Tang dynasty. Now, Teneno had become a wealthy magnate of the western regions. Yang Fan, on the other hand, had transformed into her most loyal servant. The wealthy western regions girl, Teneno, and her loyal servant, Yang Fan, were standing on the busiest Ding Ding Street in Luoyang at this moment. This street was filled with pedestrians. Everyone who walked on this street, whether entering or exiting, was looking for the opportunity of life, to win wealth and fame, and to express their life's aspirations. Whether it was high officials, nobles, young masters, peddlers, or beggars, they were all walking on this street, and then separately entered the mansions or shacks on the left and right side, walking under the same sky and entering into their own different lives. Here, a Persian with red hair, blue eyes, a rugged appearance, and a camel in rustic clothes could be a rich businessman who spent a lot of money. A scholar who looked well-dressed and waved a feather fan could be a skillful thief. A white-haired, trembling old man who walked with a walking stick could be an old wanderer who lived in seclusion. It was not allowed to do business on the street, but mobile peddlers could be found everywhere, taking advantage of the endless flow of people, playing hide-and-seek with the public on the 4-kilometer-long street and all the streets and alleys that extended in all directions. Tian Ai Nu wore a hat with a carved beard on her head and a veil covering her face. Although no one could see her face, based on the way she stood and the way she behaved, it was obvious that she was born in a wealthy family. She was the daughter of a noble since she was young. She was graceful and noble. Yang Fan now did not doubt her ability to pretend to be a dragon or a tiger. Teneno frowned and said, "What we need to do now is to buy a full set of clothing, a mansion, a light carriage, a maid, a manservant, and everything a noble daughter should have. To buy these things, we need to find a middleman. Why did you bring me here?" Yang Fan smiled and said, "In terms of wisdom, I am not as good as you, but after all, I have lived in Luoyang for so long and can be considered as half a local snake. In terms of knowledge, you are not as good as me. Find a middleman. A middleman needs to check the identity of the buyer. Let me ask you, can you meet people with your identity? Or can I meet people with my identity as a shopkeeper?" Although the middleman was a broker that helped to introduce workers, contact people to buy and sell servants, houses, and all kinds of tools, but the responsibility they had was not small. For example, scholars, farmers, merchants, and businessmen were all good people. So good people could not be bought as servants, even if they were willing. If the middleman mistakenly sold a good person as a lowly person, once the matter came to light and the government investigated, he would have to bear the responsibility. The middleman was also responsible for checking the identity of the hired person. Some people sold themselves just to sneak into the mansion, and when the middleman entered, they would steal the property and escape. Once this happened, the middleman would also be held responsible. In addition, whether or not the buyer had the qualifications to order around a servant, and how many servants he could order around. These were all rules. Therefore, the middleman had to know the background of both the buyer and the seller. With the two's current identity, it was naturally impossible for them to pass the middleman's test. Needless to say, Teneno's identity was shameful, and although Yang Fan currently had a proper identity, his identity was that of a shopkeeper in the Xiaowen workshop. Suddenly becoming a servant of a noble family, the middleman was a person with a lot of experience. So how could he not be suspicious? Hearing this, Teneno was startled and said, "This is a problem, but don't tell me that we are going to ask each and every person on the street if they are willing to be hired by us." Looking at the bustling crowd on the street, Yang Fan happily said, "This is the ability of a local snake. Follow me." Under the curtain of his beard, Teneno lightly pursed his lips, and with light steps he followed Yang Fan. On both sides of the wide Ding-Ding Street, there was a row of tall locust trees and elm trees, different from the behavior of some municipal officials of later generations, who would dig trees today, plant trees tomorrow, and dig trees again the day after, hiding their selfish desires and tormenting behavior. The locust trees here had been planted since the time of Sui Day and had not been touched. Therefore, they were tall, numerous, and had twisted branches. At a glance, one could tell that they had a kind of ancient, heavy charm. Aside from the crowd of people taking a morning stroll, it seemed that very few people would go near this place. Behind the elm trees was a drainage ditch 3 meters wide and deep, and behind the drainage ditch was a square wall that was 1 zhang high. Inside the ditch were square squares. Teneno followed Yang Fan to the tree, and was surprised to find that the tall square wall was actually scribbled with many scribbles. The people who wrote in this place were naturally not so-and-so was here, but some unique small posters. Xian Kong sees the house, Lu Rin determines the good and bad luck, Touch the bones to tell the fortune, Ironmouth is straight, Chong Shengfeng South Cross Street 3rd curve, Lu Xiazi. Going on the spring and autumn hunt, inviting guests. How can you not have the company of a beauty? Qingwen Fong North Cross Street, 2nd girl Xiangning. Can sing, can warm the bed, has a graceful and beautiful figure. Even if her husband is like a wolf. Won't get up until dawn. Severe winter is coming, the cold is unbearable, the high-quality charcoal is frighteningly cheap. Li Run Fong 7 curves, 2nd Street Schwelly. The price is fair, the charcoal quality is good. The 4-kilometer-long square wall had become 2 huge advertising signs, Along the way, there were all kinds of things written on it. The content was almost all-encompassing. Almost all services that one could think of could be found here. Tin Eno looked at it in amazement. As Yang Fan walked along, he held a piece of paper in his left hand and a piece of charcoal in his right, copying down the things he wanted one by one. Suddenly, a small poster came into sight. Yang Fan looked at it and was immediately embarrassed. My virtuous wife went missing for no reason. She is 16 years old. Her name is Little Min. She has a dark face, big mouth, protruding teeth, and fierce eyes. If anyone finds her, I will reward you 200 taels. I will not go back on my word, the person who wrote it. Xiao Wen Fong Cross East Street, West 3rd, Curve Big Elm Tree. Xiao Qianyue. Chapter 39. Jixian Lane, Cross Street. On the roadside there were a few large pagoda trees that were more than 10 zhang tall. Under the trees, a few bare-chested men were sitting lazily, chatting with each other. A light carriage stopped, and a young man wearing embroidered clothes and a beard hat jumped out. The man sitting under the tree glanced at them. The light carriage was luxurious, and the horse was majestic. The curtain of the carriage was hung low, and it was hard to see who was sitting inside. On the shaft of the carriage there was a little girl dressed as a servant, and her face was also very pretty. The men took a glance and then looked away. With one glance, they could tell that this was a carriage of a rich family. The owner of the carriage could not have any relationship with them, nor would he hire them to do anything. However, the handsome young man wearing embroidered clothes and a beard hat came towards them. The young man was very handsome, and his smile was very bright. When he smiled, there were 2 charming little dimples on his cheeks. Thus, one of the men stared at his luxurious clothes and secretly cursed. "A big man like you has such a beautiful smile. Why don't you go to the tenderness lane and become a bunny husband?" The people under the tree were a group of idlers, some street thugs. Sometimes they would extort some food from the innkeeper. It was not a lot, and the crime was not serious. Although the innkeeper was dissatisfied, he could not do anything to them, because this kind of crime could not be punished. Once he reported it to the authorities, it would only bring more trouble to himself. They were experts who walked on the edge of breaking the law and committing crimes, and they knew how to act appropriately. Sometimes they would also do things that really violated the law. They would accept money from others, and they would fight for others. They would act as cheap thugs. Although they were a group of shameless street thugs, as long as they accepted the business, no matter how unfavorable the situation was, they would not be afraid to run away. A gentleman valued his word, and these street thugs valued their word even more. This was because trust and righteousness were the only value in their lives. If they even lost their trust and righteousness, they would really have nothing left. Even the root of their existence would completely disappear. The handsome young man wearing the beard hat and embroidered robe looked at them with a smile and asked in a clear voice, "What, don't you do business? Seeing a customer come to visit, why don't you greet him?" The big man, sitting on the rock under the tree, looked up at him. This big fellow was undoubtedly the leader of these people. It was easy to tell who was the leader of a group of people sitting there. The leader might not necessarily have a strange appearance, but there was always something different about him. At least it could be seen from his behavior and the attitude of the people around him. These people were all street thugs and scoundrels. Naturally, they weren't people with great abilities. However, to be able to stand out among them, there must be something extraordinary about them. He glanced at Yang Fan and lazily asked, "What does your master want us to do?" As he spoke, Yang Fan's gaze had already passed over the other men with aggressive gazes and landed on him. The burly man in front of him was 8 feet tall and had dark skin. He looked as sturdy as iron. This kind of person didn't have a master to teach him. Perhaps he didn't have any brilliant skills, but with his brute strength and sturdy body, even a few big men wouldn't be able to get close to him. His arms were as thick as a normal person's thighs. 2 lines of black characters were like couplets written on the pillars of a temple. It was a tattoo. On his left arm there was the words, "Life is not afraid of the capital governor," and on his right arm there was the words, "Death is not afraid of the king of hell." Most of the men next to him also had tattoos on their bodies. There were literary tattoos and there were martial tattoos. But whether it was literary tattoos or martial tattoos, whether it was on the arms, shoulders, back, or chest, whether it was flowers, plants, snakes, insects, or beasts, all of these tattoos were overshadowed by this big man's unusually thick arms. Yang Fan smiled and said, "As long as the price is right, you will do anything, right?" The big man's eyes revealed a hint of vigilance. He said, "I and my brothers are just a group of bitter laborers in the streets. We earn some hard-earned money to support our families. We only rely on our strength. We don't dare to commit crimes, and we don't have the ability to do so. If you have any business to take care of, please speak freely. If I can take care of an errand, I will accept it." He didn't ask for the price first. A gentleman takes his promises seriously, and the people of the streets take their promises even more seriously. He didn't dare to make a rash promise. So he would take it seriously. This person was called Big Insect Chew in the streets. Big Insect was a tiger, but the grandfather of the founding emperor of the Tang dynasty, Li Yuan, was named Li Hu. Therefore, the word tiger became taboo. Even the famous general of the Sui dynasty, Han Qinhu, had the word tiger removed in the revised Book of Sui of the Tang dynasty and became Han Qinhu. Tigers were called big insects from this era. Therefore, he became Big Insect Chew, not Tiger Chew. However, with his sturdy body and mighty appearance, he was a living tiger, a tiger that was entrenched on a rock under a scholar tree. A trace of appreciation flashed in Yang Fan's eyes. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, we won't ask you to kill people and set fires. Nor will we ask you to make a long ladder and climb up to the sky to pick the moon. My young master came from the western regions and will be staying in Luoyang for a period of time. Therefore, I want to hire a few local servants. As long as you are familiar with the streets and alleys of Luoyang, know how to drink, hunt, ride, and play kudzu, and accompany my young master to relieve his boredom, it will be fine." "That's fine." Big Insect Chew gave him a deep look, and a smile appeared on his face. He slowly stood up and patted the dust off his buttocks. He smiled and said, "If it's other skills, I and my brothers are indeed not good enough. But when it comes to fighting cocks, hunting dogs, drinking, and kudzu, no one is more proficient than us." He cupped his fists and said in a clear voice, "My surname is Chu. My name is Kwanga. Please bring me and my brothers forward to greet the young master." Yang Fan said to Tin Ano cheerfully, "A luxurious mansion, luxurious cars, male and female servants, and even an incense burner with dragon saliva. Is this enough?" Tin Ano said lightly, "Not enough. How can you pretend to be a Western region's tyrant with such shabby clothes?" The branches under the large scholar tree swayed, and the sun shone brightly on the girl's face and shoulders. It was as bright as jade, pure and flawless. The fragrance of osmanthus wafted from afar, and the fragrance and beauty seeped into one's heart and mind. This beauty had such a big tone and was so generous. Yang Fan became more and more curious about her identity. At this moment, Tin Ano's tone of speech had a Western region's accent. Yang Fan really did not know that she actually knew how to use her mouth. Extremely exquisite mouth skills. Not only did she make her voice sound stiff, like a Western region's person speaking Chinese, she even proudly showed Yang Fan her even more amazing mouth skills. The voice of an old man, the voice of a child, the voice of insects and birds, the voice of wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. In fact, Yang Fan also knew mouth skills, but he was far inferior to Tin Ano. He could only change his voice into a simple man's voice, such as an old man's voice, a rough man's voice, and there seemed to be nothing that Tin Ano could not imitate. Yang Fan really could not think of anything in this world that she could not do. After listening to Tin Ano's answer, Yang Fan could not help but ask in surprise, "This is not enough? Then what do we still lack?" Tin Ano said, "We still lack a pet. How can a daughter of a wealthy family in the western regions not have a pet by her side?" Yang Fan, who was wearing a green shirt and a small hat, rolled his eyes and said, "Pet? Isn't that what I'm pretending to be now?" Tin Ano burst out laughing. Then, as if thinking of something, two blushes spread from her cheeks to the tips of her eyebrows. Yang Fan could not help but be a little stunned. Tin Ano's pretty face turned serious, and she said angrily, "You go do your work." Watching Yang Fan's back as he walked towards Chu Kwanga's group of people, Tin Ano's eyes slightly curved like a crescent moon. As a result, there was a touch of moving charm that rippled out from her watery eyes. Tin Ano said that they were still missing a pet, so they went to buy one. Pets were the norm in the Tang dynasty for the nobles, so there were places in the capital that specialized in selling pets. Yang Fan and Chu Kwanga walked behind the light carriage, talking as they walked. During the conversation, Yang Fan learned that Chu Kwanga was originally a low-ranking general in the imperial army. Because he had offended his superior, he was whipped and then kicked out of the army. Chu Kwanga did not want to talk about his unfortunate past with someone he was not familiar with, so Yang Fan did not ask too much. After a few words, Chu Tinga began to ask about their background. "My daughter's surname is Xiaoho, and her first name is Ing. Her ancestor once served as the military officer of Juchuan County during the Han Dynasty. Later, he lived in Dunhuang and changed his business. After hundreds of years, he has become a big family in Dunhuang." "Oh, then why did she only bring you to Luoyang?" Yang Fan laughed and said, "That's not true. My family's a Lang and a Langjun. A Lang Laoi Langjunshire came together, but they went to Yangzhou. At that time, because Miss caught a cold, they did not go together. Now Miss is living alone in Luoyang and is very bored, so she wants to walk around and relax." As Yang Fan explained the origin of his daughter to Chu Tinga, he secretly praised Tin Ano for his meticulous thinking. In today's world, as long as the family was above average, they would use Kunlun slaves and Korean maids, and these two kinds of maids could not be hired without the help of a middleman. But Tin Ano had smoothly solved this problem by setting up his identity as a member of a big family in Dunhuang. The big families in Dunhuang lived in the western regions, so they had not developed the habit of using Kunlun slaves and Korean maids. Instead, they often used some strong and rough men as attendants. In this way, without the help of a middleman, they could easily hire people to pretend to be servants. This girl was not simple, but he did not notice that Chu Tinga, who was slightly tilting his head to look at the light carriage, had a faint look of thought in his eyes. This marketplace was not as simple as it seemed. Chapter 40. Chu Kwanga pointed to a door in front of them and said, "We're here. This is the place. The largest pet shop in Luoyang belongs to Li Jun's family." Yang Fan hurriedly stopped the carriage and said to Chu Kwanga, "Brother Chu, tell your brothers to wait outside. We'll accompany Miss to the pet shop to take a look." Chu Kwanga agreed and ordered a few brothers to guard the carriage under a tree at the entrance of the alley. Tin Ano put on a carved beard hat and leisurely got out of the carriage, followed by a maid in green. Yang Fan and Chu Kwanga, one on the left and the other on the right, led the way into the pet shop. This was the trading square, located in the northeast corner of Luoyang City. Because it was north of the Luo River and close to the imperial city, it was a place where high officials and nobles liked to live. Therefore, although the trading square was located at the edge of the city, the land was more expensive than most of the shops south of the Luo River. Even so, Li Jun's shop occupied a large area, even larger than the mansions of many officials. However, from afar, the mansions of nobles and nobles could be seen with domed eaves and flying corners. Inside, there were pavilions everywhere. Although Li Jun's pet shop occupied a large area, the courtyard was empty and the houses were sparse. This was because most of the houses here were animal houses for all kinds of pets. The door of Li Jun's house was open, and there were no family members guarding it. When the three of them entered, they saw not only many merchants and merchants, but also many noble men and women in brocade clothes. They were being served by male and female servants, entering and exiting the house. It was very lively. Li Jun's house only sold one kind of thing: animals. In modern terms, he opened a pet shop. In this pet shop, animal houses and rooms were built everywhere. The big ones were like palaces, and the small ones were only the size of a palm. A gust of wind blew, and the smell of many birds and animals mixed together. It was really not a good smell. Tineno and the maid behind her couldn't help but cover their noses. "Young lady, is this your first time here?" An old man in plain clothes, with his sleeves rolled up, quickly came up to greet him. With a face full of smiles, he cupped his hands and bowed to Tineno. This man looked to be in his 50s, with grizzled hair and a thin figure. His eyebrows and the corners of his eyes were full of shallow wrinkles, but his spirit was very bright. Chu Kwanga stood at the side and introduced, "Master, this person is the shopkeeper of this shop." Li Jun, hearing this, Tineno nodded slightly. He turned his hat slightly and looked at Yang Fan, indicating for him to speak. Yang Fan took a step forward and said to Li Jun, "My young lady wants to buy a pet to her liking. Please introduce it to me." With business knocking on his door, Li Jun's face was full of smiles as he repeatedly said, Of course, of course. This is the young lady's first time here. I will lead the way for the young lady." Li Jun led Tineno all the way down. There were things that flew in the sky, walked on the ground, swam in the water, poisonous and non-poisonous. Everything was there. Crickets, spiders, parrots, hawks and hawks, all kinds of goldfish, monkeys, fighting cocks, fierce Tibetan mastiffs, well-behaved forest dogs, Persian cats, cranes, deer, turtles, and even donkeys and sheep were all kept as pets. "Young lady, please take a look. What do you think of this gorilla slave? This gorilla is so ugly." "Hee. Then young lady, please take a look here. What do you think of this long-eared male? Its hair is like a black satin, glossy and shiny. The donkey's braying is so unpleasant. Ha. Then this snow-clothed lady is clever and clever. Young lady, you will definitely like it. No, I like to ride, shoot, and relax in the countryside. This parrot is not suitable for me." Tineno walked all the way, only shaking his head. Li Jun's face was a little embarrassed. He couldn't help but ask, "I wonder what kind of pets the young lady likes." Tineno tilted his head and thought for a moment before replying, "It would be best if it could accompany me to relieve my boredom and accompany me to hunt when I go out of the city to hunt." Li Jun heaved a sigh of relief and said, "That's easy. Young lady, please follow me." Li Jun led them quickly to a doghouse and introduced, "Young lady, how about choosing a hound? The hounds here are all precious breeds of dogs from the East and West countries. They have all been carefully trained. They understand human nature and human language. They are the best companions for hunting and playing." Tineno lightly said, "I don't like dogs. I've never liked them." Yang Fan remembered what she had told him that night. The domestic dogs had become wild dogs, roaming the village with wolves, eating humans. He couldn't help but look at her deeply. Li Jun's voice choked as he thought to himself, "This guest is not easy to deal with. However, since she has entered my house, if I don't let her return satisfied, wouldn't that ruin my reputation?" Li Jun thought for a moment and said, "Since that's the case, please follow me to the backyard. The price of the pets there is a higher level." Yang Fan said, "Sir, just choose a pet that my lady likes. As for the price, it's not a problem." Li Jun led them into the backyard and walked to a cage. He pointed inside and said, "Young lady, please take a look. What do you think of these lynx? This lynx has sharp teeth and claws and is the best at hunting. Not only does it understand human nature, but it also looks good. It is a pet that the nobles in the capital like very much. It's just that this lynx only eats meat and doesn't eat vegetables. The daily expenses are a bit too high." Tineno gently shook her head. Although there was a thin veil hanging on her face, Anyone could see that she didn't even look at the lynx in the cage. Ever since she entered the backyard, her eyes had been staring at the strongest iron cages at the end of the yard. Li Jun saw her staring at the end of the yard and coughed. There are 2 cheetahs in the cage over there. This leopard is fierce by nature. If it is already an adult, it is difficult to get rid of its bestial nature and train it. Therefore, the cheetahs here are all caught from a young age and brought here for training. Therefore, it is not easy to sell them. My wife, please think about it. After so many years of feeding it, not counting the manpower and the training master's salary, it needs to eat more than 10 kilograms of meat a day. Tin Ano waved her hand and didn't listen to his long-winded words. She walked straight over, and with a gentle sweep of her eyes, she saw the beautiful female leopard. Li Jun said, "Little lady, this leopard is worth." Tin Ano raised a slender finger and stopped Li Jun from speaking. Then she slowly pointed at the slender and beautiful female leopard and said, "That's it." The female leopard seemed to understand her words. At this moment, it raised its head and opened its bloody mouth, revealing a mouthful of sharp, snow-white teeth. It let out a roar that shook the entire cage. Then it stretched out its slender, blood-red tongue and elegantly licked the tip of its nose. In the Tang Dynasty, the Hu people opened businesses in the Tang Dynasty. Most of them were jewelry stores and hotels. There was no need to talk about jewelry. Whether it was the style or the quality of the jewelry in the Western region, they were all better than the jewelry in the Tang Dynasty. There were many Hu restaurants because there were Hu concubines in the Hu restaurants. Men were the largest consumer group in the hotel. A young and beautiful Hu concubine serving wine would naturally attract the customers. Picking a lotus and throwing it on the water, the lover's mind is on the floating flower. Wine and beauty complemented each other. There were too few women from the Han family working as waitresses in public, so they were not competitive. Because of this, the Hu restaurants grew larger and higher in quality. They became the favorite places for high officials, nobles, and wealthy merchants to stay. As a result, the large restaurants in Chang and An Luoyang were mostly opened by the Hu. Dunho Square was adjacent to Bay City and was an extremely lively place in Luoyang. The Golden Hairpin Drunk in Dunho Square was one of the best Hu restaurants in Luoyang. When Tin Ano brought Yang Fan and the green-clothed servant girl in, there were a few Hu concubines dancing on the stage. The restaurant was extremely large, but it only had 1 floor. In the middle was a circular performance stage that was 2 feet tall. The stage was several feet in diameter, and the tables in all directions were facing each other with the stage as the center. If there were customers who did not want to be seen by others, the waiter would bring over a screen and place it on the 3 sides of the table. There would be a folding screen facing the front of the stage. If the customers did not like the performance on the stage and wanted a more private environment, they could use the folding screen to block the front of the table. This would create a private room where no one could be seen on all 4 sides. But the people who came here to drink would rarely block all 4 sides. They came here to drink for the wine and beauty. So how could they block the beauty from the table? When they were happy, they would even jump onto the stage and dance with the Hu concubines. Sometimes they would even drive the Hu concubines away and have a solo dance. The customers who could appear here were either rich or noble. It would be hard to imagine the behavior of these people in other dynasties. Can you imagine an old man in his 70s who is the richest man in the world, or a scholarly leader in his 60s, or an envoy in his 50s, dancing and dancing to entertain himself in front of his friends, attendants, subordinates, or even complete strangers in a drunken manner? But in this era it was very normal. Not only was it normal for those revered and lofty figures, it was also normal for those married women who had children or girls who were still in their boudoirs. This had nothing to do with status or identity, but was a kind of custom. From the Wei, Jin, Northern, and Southern dynasties to the Sui and Tang dynasties, the Hu and the Han had been closely integrated. After several hundred years, the culture ideology, customs, and habits of the who had been absorbed by the Han culture of the Central Plains, becoming a part of it. When the high officials and nobles were in the mood to drink, they would sing and dance in public, becoming a very elegant and tasteful activity. When the news of Li Jing's annihilation of the Turks reached the capital, the emperor of the Tang dynasty, Li Shimin, was wild with joy. He pushed away the dancers and singers and began to dance in the main hall. Li Yuan, who was then the emperor emeritus, even snatched the pipa from the singer's hands to accompany his son. The officials also joined in the commotion, leaving their seats and running to the main hall, singing and dancing. Imagine a group of old men wearing the robes of civil and military officials, either bearded or white-haired, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws in the solemn main hall. It was like a group of demons dancing in a frenzy. More than 10 years later, Crown Prince Li Zishi had his eldest son. As his grandfather, Li Shimin ran to his son's eastern palace and led the dance. The emperor was like this, the officials were like this, and among the common people, this kind of phenomenon was even more common. In the hotel, everyone was enjoying themselves. No one noticed the 3 people who had just walked in. Chapter 41. Along the way, Yang Fan quickly swept his eyes over the situation in the hotel. There was a table on the west, with 7 or 8 men wearing hats and gowns, drinking to their heart's content. On their table, there was a human urging them to drink. It was a ceramic figure of a human that looked like a tumbling doll, with red hair and blue eyes, a pointy nose, and one hand pointing forward. The porcelain figure turned until it stopped, and whoever it pointed at, that person would be punished with a cup of wine. The rest of the people were clapping their hands and enjoying the wine. There was also a table on the east, with 2 merchants sitting opposite each other, surrounded on 3 sides by seating screens, leaving only one side of the stage open. There were a few dishes on the table, with 2 slender, enchanting concubines diligently serving the dishes and urging them to drink. The 2 merchants sitting opposite them were drinking in low voices, as if they were discussing business. Yang Fan did not have time to look too much. He accompanied Tin Ano to a seat closest to the stage and sat down. He first asked the waiter to move the seating screens and surround 3 sides. Only then did Tin Ano take off his curtain hat and gracefully kneel down in front of the table. Yang Fan sat on the side and said to Tin Ano in a low voice, "We have arrived a little early. The one surnamed Lu has not arrived yet." Tin Ano said in a low voice, "As long as he is willing to come today, there will be a way to attract his attention. For a man like him, as long as we can attract his attention, won't it be just a little trick to make him obediently submit?" Yang Fan said with a bitter laugh, "A little trick? The expenses these past few days are really not small. Just that leopard alone. In these 2 days, he ate more meat than I ate in a year." Tin Ano stammered, "Those pearls and jades were originally my gift to you as thanks. Since you are so generous and insist on taking them out to help your friend in trouble, how can I not spend them all to help you fulfill your reputation of being supremely righteous?" Yang Fan made a distressed expression and sighed. "If you can help me save some, I am sure it will not be too shabby." Tin Ano raised his chin and snorted. "Normally, I do not have many opportunities to put on airs, but today I can be generous with other people's money. I will definitely not be stingy." Just as he said this, a human with a sharp nose and dark green eyes walked in, bowed and smiled. "Honored guest, your presence brings light to my humble dwelling. I wonder what food young lady would like to order." There were no recipes in this era. Those menus only appeared during the late Qing dynasty and the Republic of China. In this era, if one wanted to order food, one had to look at the sign hanging above the wine cabinet, or let the wine expert show you the name of the dishes. "Wine expert," Tin Ano said. "Wine expert. Pick some good dishes from your restaurant and bring some good wine." Yang Fan's eyes looked at his nose looked at his heart, and sighed in his heart, this prodigal woman. In the restaurant, when watching the song and dance, all the tables were very quiet. Only the 7 or 8 people gathered in one place would occasionally burst into laughter. thinking that the who persuaded the wine expert was pointing at someone else. When that Huji left, 2 actors came up to perform the Joining the Army play, and the atmosphere in the restaurant became relaxed and lively. Joining the Army play was a kind of opera invented by the 5 barbarians during the 16 Kingdoms period. At that time, there was an official who joined the army who embezzled public funds and accepted bribes. After the incident was discovered, an enemy ordered the actor to wear official robes and pretend to be a soldier to perform on stage, while another actor ridiculed him. As a result, this form of performance was very popular. Some actors were inspired and continued to use other stories to perform similar short scenes. This form of performance was then established and named after the main character of the first play, the soldier. It was called Joining the Army play. This play was indeed the ancestor of the later generations of opera. Although the form of performance at that time was very simple, there were only 2 people from beginning to end, and the style was also comical, but later on, the number of people who participated in the performance increased, and the roles began to develop, such as shengdan qinemo and other professions, and the plot became more and more complicated. At that time, opera had not yet become popular, and singing and dancing were still the main content of entertainment. Therefore, this Joining the Army play was just a formality, because it was almost time for dinner, and a large number of drinkers were about to take their seats. The play being performed on stage was based on the legend of the cowherd and the weaver maid. There were only 2 characters on stage. One was the weaver maid, and the other was not the cowherd, but the weaver maid's lover. The plot was very simple. It was about the weaver maid often descending to the mortal world to meet her lover. The lover asked her if she felt uneasy leaving the cowherd alone on the other side of the Milky Way, and was worried that the cowherd would find out about his affair with the weaver maid. The weaver maid did not care. "What does my business have to do with him?" Instead, she comforted the lover not to worry, saying that the Milky Way was far away, and the cowherd would not find out. This small play was humorous and mixed with a lot of pornographic content, but it was said in a more reserved and elegant manner. After all, the people present were either rich or noble, and they would not like things that were too vulgar. However, not liking vulgarity did not mean that they did not like such topics. Every time the drinkers understood the hidden meaning between the 2 actors, they would laugh knowingly. Yang Fan had never come into contact with such things, so he watched with great interest. Not long after, the dishes were served. Although Tin Eno had said that as long as it was his specialty, the restaurant did not fill the table with expensive dishes, but according to the number of people eating, a few delicious dishes were prepared appropriately. There were 8 dishes, including soft beef intestines, golden millet hammering, sheepskin silk, 8 immortal's plate, snow baby immortal meat, small heavenly crisps, and pig's head spring. There were also 24 wontons. The 24 wontons had different shapes and fillings, so there were 24 different flavors, and the dishes were very particular. At this time, the more particular places still followed the Han tradition and carried out the separate meal system. Therefore, in front of Yang Fan and Tin Eno there was a table each. The same dish was served on 2 sets of plates and was sent to the 2's table. The wine was Lonling wine with sandalwood, broadwood, male clove, and honey. It was golden yellow in color, and the wine was fragrant. The fragrance could be felt from afar. Even if one drank it, one would not feel a headache, dry mouth, or diarrhea. This was Shandong's Lonling wine with a very long history. It was said that the water there was used to weigh things and was heavier than water from other places. The wine here was pure and delicious, probably because of the water quality. The 2 ate the dishes, tasted the wine, and waited quietly. The number of customers gradually increased. The 2's position was very good, diagonally from the door. As long as a customer entered the door, they would certainly see them. Not long after, they saw Lu Junfan carefully escorting a well-dressed woman into the room. Yang Fan gave Tin Eno a look, and Tin Eno's eyelids slightly drooped down. More than 90% of the guests had arrived. Amidst the clamor, Dongling, the manager of Drunken Golden Hairpin, suddenly walked onto the stage with a smile on her face. She bowed in all directions and loudly said, "Honored guests, please be quiet, please be quiet." The inn was silent, and everyone looked at Dongling, not knowing what this bearded Persian wanted to do. Dongling smiled wholeheartedly and said, "Honored guests, this morning, someone came to my inn to consign a cup of good wine. Logically speaking, my Drunken Golden Hairpin already has the best wine from all over the world. Why would I need to consign it on behalf of someone else? But this cup of wine, I first tasted it, haha, it really is good wine." Drunken Golden Hairpin was one of the best hotels in Luoyang, and Luoyang was the most prosperous place in the Tang dynasty where high officials and nobles gathered. In other words, Drunken Golden Hairpin was one of the best hotels in the entire Tang dynasty, and Dongling said that his inn had gathered the best wine from all over the world. And it was not a lie. However, under such circumstances, the shopkeeper of Dongling Mountain had actually done the business of consignment sale that only small wine shops in the countryside would do. Furthermore, he had personally appeared and solemnly introduced the wine to the guests. It could be seen that this wine was extraordinary. Which guest present didn't like the wine? All of them perked up and listened to his detailed explanation. Dongling said, "This cup of wine comes from the western regions. It's a cup of grape wine, and it's extremely delicious, far better than any of the fine wines sold in this inn." Before he finished speaking, he caused a commotion among the guests. At this time, the Central Plains also produced wine, but the best quality wine still came from the western regions. Even the wine brewed in the Central Plains was extremely expensive, and the wine from the western regions was even more expensive. Wine Jean Wulua Wu Ji 15 Fine Horse Pack. This was a story about a married young girl who brought her dowry to her husband's house. The dowry she brought was wine and Jean Wulua. Jean Wulua was an utensil made of pure gold, which meant that the price of this high-quality wine was comparable to utensils made of gold. Golden Hairpin Drunken even sold the most famous wines of that time, such as Jiannan Roasted Spring and Fooping Stone Frozen Spring. The variety of wine was also quite complete. Now that the owner actually said that this cup of wine was better than all of the famous wines in the inn, it naturally shocked everyone. Among the 7 or 8 scholars, there was already someone who couldn't wait to ask, "What's so good about this wine, and how much is it worth?" A woman's voice suddenly rang out, "Bring me the wine." As soon as the voice came out, everyone was silent. He didn't even ask for the price and directly ordered someone to bring the wine to him. Not every guest had the guts to say such a thing in the Golden Hairpin Drunk. The one who spoke was Madame Yao. Madame Yao often came to Golden Hairpin Drunken, and this woman loved good wine, especially grape wine. Yang Fan had already inquired about this and was clear about it. Today, Madame Yao was coming to Golden Hairpin Drunken, and he had also asked Chu Kwanga and the City Fox Society's rats to find out in advance. Dong Ling bowed and said with a smile, "Madame Yao is a regular customer of this inn, but if there's an order, there's no reason for this old man to refuse. However, there's one thing. This guest who consigned this fine wine is in urgent need of money, so he told this old man that this fine wine must be sold in public to the highest bidder. This old man was entrusted by someone, so I don't dare to privately give it to you." At that time, no matter if it was doing business or dealing with people, they all paid particular attention to the word trustworthiness. Although there were people who broke their promises, there were even more people who valued trustworthiness. Dongling's words made all the guests nod their heads, and Madame Yao didn't have anything else to say. She proudly said, "If that's the case, then don't keep us in suspense. Let's begin. I want to see who here can pay a higher price than me." Chapter 42. Although Dongling himself was only a merchant, he had opened such a high-class hotel and had seen who knew how many truly rich and powerful people. He actually didn't care too much about a nouveau riche like Madame Yao. However, he only smiled and lightly waved his hand. Immediately, a woman dressed in a crimson dress gracefully walked onto the stage. This Huji was tall and slender, graceful and beautiful. She had golden hair and blue eyes, and was filled with an exotic charm. Her beautiful eyes looked around, and there was a gentleness like flowing water. Her breasts were high, and her waist was slender. A fiery red pomegranate skirt was tied around her slim waist, swaying her beautiful round bottom that could cause the downfall of nations and people. In her hand was a light blue glazed wine goblet. The mouth of the goblet had a stopper made of poplar wood wrapped in red silk. The Huji raised the goblet high and leisurely circled around the round stage. The shape of the goblet was 70 to 80% similar to the enchanting figure of this beauty. Dongling raised his voice and said, "Everyone, I said that this fine wine is rare because of its brewing method. This wine's brewing method is very different from other grape brews. Its alcohol strength is more than 2 times that of ordinary wine. Therefore, the taste of the wine is very sweet. Such a fine wine can be said to be priceless. Everyone, you have come today. Now I invite all of you to bid." The Dongling wine seller was a famous wine tasting master. If he said that this wine was more delicious than all the other wines in his shop, then it was definitely true. No one would question his evaluation, and it was not appropriate for them to ask to taste it first. There was only one goblet of wine, and if the customers in the shop each took a sip, how much would be left? What everyone was concerned about was who this goblet of wine would belong to. In reality, this goblet of wine was indeed different from the wine commonly seen on the market. At this time, ordinary wine was heated and sterilized before adding yeast to ferment it into wine. However, this bottle of wine was made using a rare distillation method, a grape wine. Regarding the brewing of grain distilled wine, there had always been a saying that it originated from the Tang, Song, and Yuan dynasties. In reality, with the discovery of antiques, there was physical evidence that proved that distilled wine had already existed in the Song dynasty. If one was a little more daring, they could even speculate that it had already appeared in the late Tang dynasty. However, it was absolutely impossible for it to be any earlier. Otherwise, how could there be no records of high-alcohol liquor among the many poems left by the Tangs? But distilled spirits still did not exist at this time, but the technology to steam wine with grapes had already appeared. However, this technology currently only existed in the western regions and was in the hands of an extremely small number of who. These winemakers knew that this distillation technique was better than the traditional way of making wine. But once they expanded their business, this exclusive technique would inevitably spread, so they kept it a secret. As a result, small workshops could only produce a limited amount of distilled wine. The transportation of wine was very troublesome, and the production was very low. Therefore, the appearance of this fine wine in Luoyang made it especially precious. The few scholars in loose robes discussed in low voices. They pooled together some money, and then one of them shouted, "We'll pay 10,000 taels." In this era, ordinary officials could buy a bucket of rice wine for 300 coins. Wine worth 10,000 coins was already the highest grade wine on the market. Later on, the immortal of poetry, Li Bai, drank fine wine that cost 10,000 taels a bucket. As for Du Fu, who was in dire straits, he often drank inferior wine that cost 300 taels a bucket. The price offered by these people could be considered fair. Madame Yao sat at the back of the table, curling her lips into a cold smile. Lu Junfan covered her mouth and laughed. These people actually dare to compete with Madame's wealth. They really overestimate themselves. Why don't we see how much more others can raise the price? I'll go bring the wine over and offer it to Madame to taste, so that we don't have to raise the price again and disturb Madame's mood. Madame Yao nodded her head with a smile, appearing extremely arrogant. At this time, the 2 merchants who were discussing business also excitedly joined the competition. One of them shouted, 15,000 coins. This price was already extremely high. Furthermore, these 2 merchants had raised the price to 5,000 coins. It would not be good for others to raise the price by 300 and 500 coins. Was there a need for such a price just for a cup of wine? The atmosphere immediately turned cold. Seeing that no one was raising the price so quickly, Madame Yao couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. She slightly raised her chin. Lu Junfan understood and loudly shouted, 20,000 coins! Immediately, a wave of dejected sighs could be heard from all around. The merchant who had raised the price slightly knitted his brows and hesitated for a moment. However, he had just negotiated a large business deal and originally wanted to win this cup of good wine to share with his business partners. At this time, it was naturally not good for him to show his cowardice. Thus he said, 25,000 coins. This price was somewhat unreasonable. No matter how good the wine was, it was not worth this price. Lu Junfan hesitated for a moment and turned to look at Madame Yao. Madame Yao angrily said, Trash! Do you think I can't afford it? Lu Junfan immediately raised 3 fingers and proudly shouted, 30,000 coins! The merchant groaned inwardly. Although he was extremely wealthy, taking out 35,000 coins just to buy a bottle of wine was still too extravagant. However, in front of an esteemed guest, it was not good for him to back down. He could only grit his teeth and shout, 35,000 coins! In the private room to the south, Yang Fan frowned and said to Teneno in a low voice, This is bad. A merchant has appeared out of nowhere. If the two of them can't compete and Madame Yao withdraws, it will be difficult for us to proceed with the next step of our plan. Teneno quickly glanced outside and said in a low voice, That shouldn't be the case, since this Madame Yao is used to being domineering. Even though the price is a little high, she will still buy it for the sake of her pride. Teneno smiled and softly said, Men care about their face, but in reality, women care about their face even more than men do. Just as Teneno finished speaking, Lu Junfan fiercely shouted, 45,000 coins! It seemed that Madame Yao was also worried about cutting her own flesh with a blunt knife. If she increased the price by 55,000 coins, the two sides would not be able to come to an agreement. If she gave up, she would lose face. If she didn't give up, she would feel the pain of spending the money. Thus, she might as well raise the price by 10,000 coins and hope that the other side would back down. The Persian was now riding on a tiger's back. He was about to raise the price when the merchant next to him pulled him back and whispered a few words to persuade him. The Persian took the opportunity to get out of the situation. He put on a resentful look and stopped bidding. Dong Ling stood on the stage, beaming with joy. The person who had consigned the fine wine for sale insisted on selling it in public. At first, he didn't think much of it, but since he had received a commission of 500 coins, all he had to do was help the seller sell the wine. So he didn't mind. He didn't expect that this bottle of wine would actually sell for a high price of 45,000 coins. Although the price was fixed at the beginning, no matter how high it was sold, he wouldn't be able to take a cut from it. However, once this news spread, it would undoubtedly raise the reputation of his golden hairpin drunk. This profit would truly belong to him. Dong Ling's face was full of smiles as he said, 45,000 coins, Madame Yao bids 45,000 coins. Is there anyone else who wants to raise the price? The surroundings were completely silent. Dong Ling shouted twice, but no one responded. He then said, If there is no one willing to raise the price, then this bottle of fine wine will belong to Madame Yao. Yao Yin lightly raised her chin again, her expression incomparably arrogant. Lu Junfan hurriedly stood up and walked quickly to the stage. As he walked, he looked left and right, immensely proud of himself. Lu Junfan jumped onto the stage. Just as he was about to take the wine bottle from the hands of the gaudy Huji, an extremely clear and melodious voice suddenly came from one of the private rooms. 60,000 coins! Just as Lu Junfan's hands touched the wine bottle, his smile froze on his face. He slowly turned his head and looked towards Madame Yao. The surrounding guests all looked towards the source of the voice. Madame Yao's eyebrows twitched as a wave of anger suddenly rose. Her pair of sharp eyes fiercely glared around, suppressing all the discussions that had arisen. In a loud voice she shouted, 70,000 coins! Almost as soon as her voice fell, that melodious female voice rang out again, 80,000 coins! Huh! The clamor that had just been suppressed by Madame Yao's gaze could no longer be stopped. Sounds of exclamations, gasps of cold air, and the sounds of people craning their necks to inquire about the identity of the buyer rose one after another. Madame Yao was so angry that her entire body trembled. She fiercely glared towards that private room. Yang Fan was sitting to the side and was also in a lower position. Thus, Madame Yao did not even glance at him. Her gaze was firmly fixed on Tin Ano. This was a little girl with a sweet smile. She was younger than her, prettier than her, and wealthier than her. Competition had already made her angry. The other party was also a woman, which made her even more hostile. Furthermore, this person of the same gender was far superior to her in all aspects. Madame Yao could no longer suppress the jealousy in her heart. Madame Yao clenched her teeth and said word by word, 90,000 coins! 100,000 coins! The manager of Golden Hairpin Drunken, Dongling, felt as if she had suddenly drunk a cup of the highest quality wine. Her head was a little dizzy, her hands were trembling, and her body felt a little light. 100,000 coins for a cup of wine. The women of the Tang dynasty were truly heroic. Chapter 43. Dongling danced with joy. She retreated and stepped on the tip of Huji's foot, causing Huji to cry out in pain. Dongling turned pale with fright and quickly turned around to support the wine cup in Huji's hand. She said, "Be careful, this is 100,000 taels. If it breaks, I'll use you to pay the debt." When Huji heard this, she was shocked. She quickly hugged the wine cup tightly to her bosom, putting on a heroic look that said, "If the cup lives, the person dies. Madam, I think, let's forget about it. It's just a bottle of wine. How can it be worth so much money?" Lu Junfan, who had just swaggered onto the stage, took advantage of everyone's attention being focused on the private room to come down from the stage. She embarrassedly moved to Madame Yao's side and quietly advised her. Madame Yao ignored her and only fiercely glared at Tin Ano. She clenched her fists and shouted, 120,000 taels! Unfortunately, even though she had increased the price by 20,000 taels, there was no effect at all. Everyone held their breath and looked at the private room, waiting for the young girl to increase the price. The young girl did not disappoint. Her crisp voice rang out again, 200,000 taels! There was still no noise in the audience. It wasn't that the price wasn't high enough, but because the sudden increase in price was so unexpected that everyone was momentarily stunned. Of course, Tin Ano wasn't afraid of bidding. This fine wine cup was brought by her. Even if she called out a price of 10 million taels, her total loss would only be the 500 taels she had paid the owner. What was there for her to be afraid of? Madame Yao's expression greatly changed. Her originally straight back slightly bowed. Only then did the noise of the audience spread through the entire restaurant like a tornado. It was unknown who knocked over the wine pot or who knocked over the wine cup. There was also someone who stood up and looked around. However, because he couldn't keep his footing, he fell onto a screen and knocked it to the ground. In the city of Luoyang, it was not uncommon to see people fighting for their wealth. It was said that on a hot summer day, there was once a noble young master who was enjoying the cool air by the Luo River. In passing, he plucked a pearl from his waist and threw it into the river, telling a Kunlun slave who was an expert in swimming to get it. The Luo River was deep and turbulent. How could it be so easy to find a pearl? 9 out of 10 pearls simply could not be found. But that was just a rumor after all. 200,000 for a cup of wine was something that he had seen with his own eyes. How was this any different from throwing pearls into the water? Tin Ano smiled and ordered, "Ku'er, go get the wine." Ku'er was the green-clothed maidservant that she had hired. This girl's figure and appearance were quite pleasant, but her IQ seemed to be a little low, so no one was willing to hire her. Tin Eno actually liked to keep her by his side. If she didn't understand things, then she wouldn't meddle. He would just treat her as a decoration. When he was discussing things with Yang Fan, he didn't need to be overly careful. Ku-er agreed and walked up to the stage. She took the cup of wine from the hands of Hu-ji, who would rather die in glory than live in disgrace, and walked back. When she got off the stage, she actually jumped off in a daze. The surrounding customers were all on tenterhooks, afraid that she would trip and 200,000 would go down the drain. Madame Yao was so angry that her face turned pale and her body trembled. Lu Junfan smiled and tried to persuade her, "Madam, how can a cup of wine be worth 200,000? Why do we need to lower ourselves to the same level as these people? Scram! You're so noisy, so hateful." Madame Yao vented all of her anger on him. She gave him a tight slap on the face, causing Lu Junfan to see stars. Madame Yao's face was filled with hostility as she said, "Scram and stand outside. This old lady is sick of seeing you." Okay, don't be angry. Lu Junfan walked out of the private room in a sorry state. The scene that happened in the private room was covered up by the clamor of the entire restaurant. Therefore, only a few customers on the opposite side of the stage, as well as the manager of Dongling Mountain and that Hu-ji saw it. Even so, seeing their strange gazes, Lu Junfan still felt extremely ashamed. He stood at the door of the private room, dressed like a servant, so he could only slowly move his body, pretending to move to the left and right, as if he wanted to go to the toilet, so as to avoid arousing other people's curiosity. Ku-er carried the cup of wine back to the private room. Tin Eno took the cup in his hand, gently pinched it, and reached out to pull out the cork. Immediately, the fragrance of the wine filled the room. Tin Eno filled 2 cups with the fragrant wine and pushed 1 cup to Yang Fan. Yang Fan took the cup and carefully sniffed it. He felt that the fragrance was overflowing with a hint of sweetness. It really smelled good. Tin Eno gently swirled the wine cup, sniffed the fragrance in the cup, and took a sip. He closed his eyes and savored it for a moment, then drank it in 1 gulp. His face relaxed as he said, "It really is a good wine." He looked at Yang Fan and saw that he was looking at him, so he squinted at him and said, "Why aren't you drinking?" Yang Fan smiled and said, "That 1 sip will cost me a few hundred coins. I can't bear to drink it." "Is it expensive?" "Isn't it expensive?" "It's not expensive." Tin Eno shook his head, slightly narrowed his eyes, and said, "In the past, a bowl of rice soup was hard to find even with 1,000 gold. Today, a cup of good wine from the Central Plains is shipped from tens of thousands of miles away. Is it expensive? It's not expensive at all. Come, let's drink. This is the first time I'm drinking with someone, and also the first time I'm asking someone to drink with me. This cup of wine, let's drink it all." Golden hairpin drunk, shopkeeper Dongling sold an extremely expensive cup of wine and couldn't restrain his joy. Seeing that Madame Yao was indignant, in order to ease the atmosphere, after he left the stage, he ordered for the singing and dancing instruments to be quickly prepared. In a short while, the sound of drums rang out, and a youth wearing a pointed hat and a thin felt shirt carried a dark green lacquer plate onto the stage. The dark green lacquer plate was 3 feet in diameter and looked like a large lotus leaf that had opened up. When the lotus leaf was placed on the floor, that youth who leaped onto the plate and danced along with the rapid sounds of the jia drum. This youth, who was about 15 or 16 years old. His skin was as white as jade and his nose was like an awl. He hooked his hands and stirred his sleeves, swayed his head and twisted his hips, lifted his knees and jumped. Sometimes he leaned to the east and west, and sometimes he did a roundhouse kick. Every movement was in response to the sound of the drums and was filled with the beauty of his movements. But no matter how graceful his dance was, his feet never took a step out of the round plate. Some of the more knowledgeable customers saw this brilliant Hu Tenguo and couldn't help but cheer. Yang Fan and Tin Ano watched the dance and drank the wine. Very quickly, the two of them drank more than half of the cup of wine. The wine that Tin Ano drank was more than 2 times stronger than ordinary wine, and the after-effects were very long. At this time, the wine faintly took effect, and Tin Ano's jade-like, clear cheeks seemed to be smeared with a layer of rouge. A faint blush appeared on her cheeks. This was the first time that young Fan saw her drink, and he didn't expect her to drink so quickly. Without any persuasion, she drained the cup. She was a complete drunkard. He couldn't help but say, "Don't drink so quickly." Although this wine is sweet and mellow, the shopkeeper also said that the strength of this wine is more than 2 times stronger than the best wine in his shop. "Don't get drunk." Tin Ano held the cup in her hand and said charmingly, "How can I get drunk with this little wine? This wine has already been opened, and there is no ice cellar to keep it. It won't be long before it turns sour. Just drink it all." As she said this, she smiled at young Fan and said, "What? A man can't even drink as much as a girl like me." She tilted her head and looked at young Fan. There seemed to be a faint trace of seduction in her eyes. Young Fan was still at the age of Muay. He couldn't help but feel his heart skip a beat. He raised his cup and said, "Good. Although I don't drink often, I'm confident that my ability to drink is not below yours. If you want to enjoy yourself, I'll keep you company. Cheers." The two of them raised their cups from afar and drank it all in one gulp. After Hu'er finished her dance, she picked up the dark green lacquer plate and retreated amidst the cheers of the entire hall. Several Huji danced up onto the stage. What was the most popular dance in Luoyang? Of course, it was the Huxian dance. Who in the world could dance the best Huxian dance? Of course, it was Huji. Who loved to watch Huxian dance? Of course, it was men. It was the nature of men. As a result, as soon as the 6 beautiful and graceful Huji went up on the stage, the entire hall was greeted with cheers. Although Tin Ano had drunk quite a lot of wine, the more he drank, the brighter his eyes became. Looking at the 6 Huji singing and dancing on the stage, young Fan couldn't take his eyes off them. He couldn't help but tease him. "Are you looking at the person or the dance?" Young Fan came back to his senses and said, "I'm not looking at the person or the dance. I'm just thinking, although you showed off your wealth in front of Lu Junfan today, how are you going to take it a step further? It's not easy to do it naturally." The corner of Tin Ano's mouth curled up. He said, "So you're worried about this. You're a man, so you think it's difficult. But for me, it's as easy as turning my hand over." Yang Fan said, "What brilliant plan does Mountaman have?" Tin Ano drank the wine in his cup in one gulp and gently placed the cup on the table. He said, "Watch me." Lightly flicking his belt, he walked out of the room. Yang Fan didn't know what she was going to do. Tin Ano had already stepped onto the stage. The customers who were watching the dance immediately became excited. They knew that this female guest was drunk and wanted to dance on the stage. Just now, some of the guests had already seen her appearance. They felt that she was pretty and lovely, tender and alluring, like a flower swaying in the wind. In terms of appearance, although the Huji on the stage had the advantage of the exotic charm, they were obviously inferior to her by a few notches. The other customers only knew that the female guest in the private room was extravagant, but it was only now that they saw her appearance. Huji's dance was something that could be seen every day. If she wasn't drunk today, it would be very difficult to watch a girl from a good family who was extravagant and wealthy like her. Therefore, all the customers applauded her. They had just seen a battle of wealth, and now they were able to see the dance of one of the victims. Today's trip was not in vain. As soon as the 6 Huji saw the female guest step onto the stage, they tacitly moved back while dancing, giving her a large space. Tin Ano seemed to be unable to drink. Her feet were a little unstable. Yang Fan couldn't help but feel worried. Tin Ano steadied herself and turned around. Seeing his concerned gaze, she couldn't help but raise her eyebrows. Her high-spirited appearance was indescribably cute. She swayed her body to the beat of the drums, waiting for the next piece of music to start. The accompaniment to this Huxian dance had a fast rhythm, vigorous and powerful. It was made up of jia drums, clappers, and other percussion instruments. The musicians on the side of the stage saw that there was a guest on the stage, so they also came to join in the fun. Suddenly, they moved the door, and the Huxian dance started playing again. The heart responded to the strings, the hands responded to the drums. With the sound of the strings and drums, Teneno's sleeves were raised high and the sleeves slid down, revealing half of her white wrists. Before anyone could see that pair of delicate and moving wrists, Teneno's body was already dancing like snow in the wind. The dance was beautiful because of the movement, and the heart was flying because of the dance. Teneno was sometimes like a snowflake floating in the air, sometimes like a fluffy grass dancing in the wind. That enchanting body was perfectly displayed as she spun. Chapter 44. Amidst the cheerful rhythm of the dance music, Teneno's clothes fluttered in the wind. Her figure was agile and light. Her waist and legs were flexible and powerful. Sometimes she stomped and sometimes she spun. That beautiful face that was like a flower appeared and disappeared as she spun left and right. It was hard for people to catch her, so it made her even more alluring. It was unknown when, but those 6 Huji had already stopped dancing and quietly retreated from the side of the stage. This stage had become Teneno's stage. That stage was also like a lotus leaf, a large round lotus leaf that was made up of hundreds of lotus leaves. Just now it was just a small lotus leaf plate, but no matter how that Huji twisted and turned, his feet never left the lotus leaf plate. It was as if that small lotus leaf plate was the entire world. But at this moment, this huge lotus leaf plate seemed to be unable to restrain Teneno's beauty and flamboyance. She moved forward and backward on the stage, left and right, turning left and right, thousands of times. Everyone was intoxicated and even forgot to cheer. Dongling looked at her solo dance in surprise. If he didn't clearly remember that it was this young girl on the stage who had just spent 200,000 yuan to buy a cup of wine, he would have immediately rushed up to the stage and offered her a high salary to stay in his hotel as a pillar. On the stage, Teneno's dance was bold and unrestrained. Everyone was infatuated with her dance, infatuated with her flame-like beauty. Only 2 people didn't have this kind of feeling. One was Madame Yao. Her heart was filled with envy, jealousy, and hatred. Right now, she only wished that Teneno would trip and fall to her death. How could she still feel her beauty? The other was Yang Fan. From Teneno's solo dance, he seemed to have tasted something different. But he was still too young, and his understanding of human nature was too little. He couldn't understand the inner monologue that was being expressed through the dance. He also appreciated Teneno's beauty and was infatuated with her dance. But because he was familiar with Teneno, he felt a little strange in his heart. Tonight, she was not like her usual personality. Ever since he brought this female thief home, she had given Yang Fan too many surprises. She was like a little maid who didn't mind being dirty or tired, cleaning up Yang Fan's dog face until it was spotless. She could also make good dishes, ordinary green vegetables and beans. Through her skillful treatment, could be turned into delicious delicacies. She was far better than the kitchen maids hired by the aristocratic families. She could make clothes. She said that the clothes she made were even more beautiful than the clothes made by Luoyang City's most famous chung-weaving workshop. Her craftsmanship was also very good. Although Yang Fan hadn't seen her make a set for him, he did not doubt her ability. Later, he saw Teneno go out and quickly return with extremely valuable treasures. Now he saw Teneno's beautiful dance that made the famous Tang dynasty's Huxian dance pale in comparison. Yang Fan really didn't know what she couldn't do. He didn't understand why she was a wanted criminal by the government, even though she had so many skills and so much wealth. Suddenly, the jia drum became urgent. The sound was like rain, and there was no pause in the middle. This was the moment when the Huxian dance was about to end, and it was also the most difficult moment of the Huxian dance. In the corner of the stage, those Huxian dance were full of surprise and disbelief. They suddenly opened their charming eyes. They admitted that Tineno's dance was better than theirs, but they didn't believe that Tineno could perfectly interpret the last movement of the dance. They had practiced countless times since they were young to have such superb dance skills. Even though this female guest was very talented, the last part of the dance was not something that could be practiced just by relying on talent. It required sweat and endless hard work. When the drum reached its climax, Tineno put her feet together and pointed her toes to the ground. She spun like a top. The drum became more and more frequent and urgent. She also spun faster and faster, spinning as if she was flying. Everyone held their breath as they watched. When they had difficulty breathing and were forced to take a deep breath, the drumming stopped abruptly, and the beautiful figure of Tian Ai Nu, who was spinning rapidly, suddenly froze in place. At this time, she crossed her feet and stood on her tiptoes. Her left hand was on her small waist, and her right hand was raised high. Her skirt was spinning like an arc, and before it completely fell down, the ribbon wrapped around her arm fluttered in the air as if it was blown by the wind. At this moment, she was like a fairy who had just stepped into the world. Good, good. Thunderous applause came from all around. Tineno's chest was heaving up and down, and the two blushes on her cheeks became even brighter. She smiled and glanced at Yang Fan, then walked down the stage. Unexpectedly, even though her dance was beautiful and she had perfectly completed the entire dance movement, she still felt dizzy from the rapid spinning. She was clearly walking towards Yang Fan, but her feet were erratic, and she actually walked in the wrong direction. Tineno took a few steps to the edge of the stage, but her feet were unstable. She stepped into the air and fell down the stage. When the customers saw her move, they knew that something was wrong. They thought that she would be able to stop in time, but now that they saw her fall down the stage, they couldn't help but cry out in alarm. Several impatient customers immediately wanted to be the hero and save the beauty, but they were not that fast. At this time, Lu Junfan, who was standing in front of the private room as punishment, was in a favorable position. Seeing a little beauty as beautiful as a flower and as beautiful as jade about to fall down the stage, he hastily dashed forward like an arrow and supported her arm. Tineno staggered and stood still. She smiled shyly toward him and said, "Thank you very much for this Longjuan's kindness in lending a hand." Lu Junfan supported the young girl's arm. He felt that it was slender and soft, warm to the touch. His nose also smelled a faint, delicate fragrance, and immediately his bones softened and his tendons went limp. Seeing this young lady with bright eyes and white teeth shyly thanking him, he immediately felt his body was as light as a swallow. Hastily, he pretended to be cultured and withdrew his hand to return the courtesy. He said, "It was just a slight effort. It's not worth mentioning. Young lady is too polite." Tineno tidied her clothes and saluted again. She said, "Your servant's surname is Xiaoho and my given name is Ing. I come from Dunhuang. I don't know Longjuan's honorable surname." Lu Junfan hastily said, "Xiao Sheng's surname is Liu. My given name is Junfan." But in his heart, he thought, "Turns out she is a wealthy merchant from the western region. No wonder she is so generous." At that time, the Tang people had a blind view of the western region and even the more distant western merchants. They thought that each and every one of them was extremely wealthy. Actually, those who were able to travel thousands of li to the Tang dynasty to do business, of course, they all had considerable strength. The people of the Tang dynasty were able to come into contact with these western merchants. Even if they were wearing coarse cotton clothes, they would still have several rare and precious treasures on them. Over time, the Tang people formed this idea in their hearts: the Westerners were rich. This was especially true for the Persians at that time. Due to the political instability, many of their sons and grandsons fled to the Tang dynasty to live in their residences. These people all had many precious jewels, which further deepened the idea that the Westerners were rich. At that time, the Tang people called Persia rich Persia. From this point on, in the Tang people's hearts, anyone from the western or western regions who could appear in the Tang dynasty was extremely wealthy. What's more, this Miss Xiaohou had just thrown out 200,000 taels to buy a cup of fine wine. Because of this first impression, and after hearing about her background, in Lu Juanfan's heart, this Miss Xiaohou was already a super rich person. Inside the private room, Madame Yao was so angry that she almost crushed her teeth. Lu Junfan was still dizzy and did not realize it. Xiaohoing thanked her again and flew back. Lu Junfan watched in a daze as her beautiful figure disappeared from the private room. Only then did she reluctantly turn around. Unexpectedly, as soon as she turned around, she saw Madame Yao's jealous and hateful eyes. Lu Juanfan's heart skipped a beat. She immediately felt that something was wrong. When Tin Ano returned to the private room, Yang Fan gave him a thumbs up and praised, "That's a good idea." Tin Ano laughed, "It's not just good. Watch me go and give him another dose of strong medicine." With that, she poured a cup of fine wine, took the cup and left. Lu Junfan saw Madame Yao's murderous gaze and was so shocked that he did not dare to enter. He was still pacing back and forth at the door of the private room, thinking about how to pacify Madame Yao. Tin Ano had already walked in front of him and said with a smile, "Just now, I snatched Lang Jun's fine wine, but Lang Jun generously helped me. I am very ashamed. This cup of wine, I toast Lang Jun to express my gratitude." Most of the Tang people were bold and unrestrained. Seeing this scene, they all laughed. Someone said, "You really don't get to know each other without fighting. The young lady is interested in you. Quickly drink this cup of fine wine." Someone slapped his thigh and sighed, "Ah, if my legs were a little faster, I would have supported the young lady, and this cup of fine wine would have been in my stomach." Someone next to him laughed and scolded, "You drunkard, you only have eyes for wine. Don't you know that a beauty is even better than wine?" Chapter 45. Being spoken to like this, Tin Ano could not help but feel somewhat bashful. Her cheeks blushed like two blooming peach blossoms, indescribably delicate and lovely. But her pair of bright and charming eyes stared at Lu Junfan with a burning passion, as if she really had some affection for him. Lu Junfan knew that if he drank this cup of wine again, Madame Yao would be even more displeased. But the beauty's affection was endless, and the men's envious gasps of admiration from all around made his heart feel like it was floating. He could not say that he did not want a drink, so he steeled his heart and took the cup. He bowed and said, "Thank you, little Nyangzi." Finished speaking, he raised his head and drained the cup of grape wine in one gulp. Tin Ano smiled sweetly and said, "Long Juan's capacity for liquor is really good, and your temperament is also very straightforward. This servant is very happy." She quickly finished speaking and gave him a brilliant smile, as if she was unable to restrain her shyness. Tin Ano lifted her pomegranate skirt and unexpectedly turned around and ran back. Lu Junfan heard such moving words, and then looked at such a moving figure his heart swayed. He could not help but think, "My Tang dynasty's women have always been straightforward, but Dunhuang's women are somewhat better. This kind of young woman is really too tasty." The lingering fragrance lingered in the air, the beautiful figure in his eyes. Lu Juanfan's heart was infatuated, and he reluctantly turned around. As soon as he saw Madame Yao, he sobered up from his drunkenness and could not help but secretly exclaim, "Bitter!" At this time, Madame Yao's face was as black as a burnt wok. On the carriage, Tin Ano leaned on the cushion and slightly closed her eyes. That wine was indeed very strong. Her identity was very special. In the past, even if she had something on her mind, she had no one to talk to. But in front of Yang Fan, this strange young man who, once they broke up, would most likely never meet again in this life, she did not need to bury everything in her heart. As long as it did not expose her current identity, she could talk. She also did not need to bury all of her true nature. If she wanted to cry, she would cry. If she wanted to laugh, she would laugh. This made her very relaxed, and the feelings that had been suppressed for a long time became somewhat indulgent. This was the first time she drank so much wine, and after the hot dance, the alcohol had taken effect. She was a bit tipsy, but this feeling of being tipsy was really very good. Yang Fan looked at her flushed cheeks and took out his cushion from behind his waist. He gently placed it on her shoulder and then placed it on her back so that she could sit more comfortably. Then he softly scolded, "If you want to get close to him, you can pretend to be drunk. Why did you really drink so much?" Tian Ainu closed her eyes and let the gentle breeze that blew in from the window caress her cheeks. Her silky hair gently swayed on her cheeks, and her ears that looked like ingots appeared and disappeared from time to time. Hearing Yang Fan's words, the Tian Ainu did not open her eyes. She replied softly, "I didn't drink because of him." "Then why?" Yang Fan asked. Tin Aino faintly shook her head and did not answer. The wheels rumbled, and it sounded a bit dull. Seeing Tin Aino leaning against the corner of the carriage, as if she had fallen asleep, Yang Fan did not ask her again. He gently leaned against the back of the seat and closed his eyes to sleep. After a long while, Tin Aino's soft voice came. "I drink. I am happy. I learned to make the best food. I learned to make the best clothes. I want to make the place I live as comfortable as possible. All of this is because I don't want to let myself be wronged." Yang Fan gently opened his eyes and looked at her. Tin Aino leaned against the corner of the carriage, as if she had fallen asleep. She still did not open her eyes, and her voice was murmuring like she was dreaming. At the corner of her eyes there were faint traces of tears, and she softly said, "Because I treat every day as if it's my last day." Yang Fan stared at her for a long time. Why would a girl as beautiful as a flower have such emotions, and why would she have such thoughts? Just what secret was hidden in her heart, and just how much pressure was she under? Yang Fan really wanted to ask her just who the person who had saved her from the mouths of the starving people was, but he only looked at her, and in the end he did not ask. The rumbling of the carriage gradually faded, and the light carriage left the green brick and flat stone crossroads and entered a narrow yellow alley. Mountains and rivers will meet. If the mountain does not go, then the water, and if the water goes, then the mountain. As long as there is a will, there will always be a meeting. Lu Junfan swallowed his anger and flattered her again and again, acting like a spoiled child. In the end, he had to use all of his skills on the bed, and finally he managed to coax Madame Yao from anger into happiness and no longer resented him. Only then did Lu Junfan relax. In order to make Madame Yao happy, a few days later he invited several of Madame Yao's close friends to go on a trip. The destination of the trip was not too far away, just by the Luo River. The news was quickly found out by Chu Kwanga City Fox Society rats, and so Xiaohing also came. The Luo River flowed slowly, accompanied by many mystical legends. For example, in the legend of the river map and the Book of Luo, when Emperor Qin was patrolling Luoyang and offering sacrifices to the Luo River, suddenly a black-head duke came out of the water and shouted to him, "Come and receive the treasure of heaven." The excited Emperor Qin danced and sang loudly, "The water of Luoyang is dark," offering sacrifices to the great marsh, suddenly facing the south. How could Wu Zetian let Emperor Shi Huang enjoy all the glory? Thus, last year, someone suddenly fished out a rock from the Luo River. On it was carved the words, "The Holy Mother descends, Yongchang Empire." Another auspicious omen had appeared in the Luo River. Wu Zetian was overjoyed and immediately named the stone Blessed Sage Illustration. The god of Luo River was named Marquis Xiansheng, and the Luo River was named Yongchang Luo River. The name of the country was also changed to Yongchang First Year. It seemed that since the beginning of this story, everyone had heard it for many eras. Could it be that many years had passed? No, it was all because Wu Zetian liked to change her year name. Women, even if it was the one and only empress since ancient times, since she was a woman, it was inevitable that she would have an emotional side. The stars were brighter today. Empress Wu was very happy and wanted to change her year name. The rainstorm tomorrow was heavier. Empress Wu was very unhappy and wanted to change her year name. The day after tomorrow, Empress Wu grew a new tooth. Empress Wu was happy again and wanted to change her year name. In this way, during the period when Empress Wu was in power, she had to change her year name 2 or even 3 times a year. As a result, there were countless years. Just based on the year name, many Tangs who wanted to talk about a certain event in a certain year and a certain month would have to calculate for a long time before they knew which year it was. Whether or not the heavens favored Wu Meinyang and allowed the god of Luo River to perform a miracle to support Wu Meinyang to continue Emperor Qin's great achievements was not important to the common people. What they cared about was whether or not their stomachs would be full. And when the miracle appeared on the Luo River, Empress Wu was happy, and in return, she decreed that fishing in the Luo River was forbidden. This made life difficult for the fishermen who lived around the Luo River. They had to either give up the fishing business that their ancestors had been engaged in for generations, or move away from the Luo River to make a living by fishing elsewhere. A large number of fishermen moved away or changed to other industries, causing the two sides of the Luo River to be quiet and secluded. It became a good place for officials and nobles to relax in the autumn. At this time, the Luo River was still a vast and boundless swamp. Boats sailed in the middle of the river, their sails erected in great numbers, blocking out the sun. The riverbank was shaded by willows and luxuriant grass. A long bridge that led straight to the main gate of the imperial palace stretched across the Luo River. The bridge was bustling with people and carriages. This bridge was called the Tianjin Bridge because it was connected to the main gate of the imperial city. Every morning, when the moon was still high in the sky, the bridge would be crowded with horses and carriages. As a result, it became a scene in Luoyang and was known as the Tianjin Morning Moon. The banks of the Luo River were quiet and peaceful. On a spacious stretch of land on the riverbank, bamboo poles were planted in the ground and a cloth fence was set up next to the river. Only the side facing the river was open to view the scenery. Inside the cloth fence, people were playing the harp, and the faint sound of singing could be heard. It seemed like a wealthy family was enjoying the autumn here. 1,000 zhang away, another area was also surrounded by a cloth fence. However, it was still several dozen steps away from the riverbank. A few servants were currently cooking outside the cloth fence, creating all sorts of delicacies. The fragrance of meat wafted through the air, and on the empty space in front of the cloth fence, there were 2 strong men wrestling with each other. Within the tent was Madame Yao and her entourage. At this time, another group of people arrived. They were dressed in bright clothes and riding vigorous horses. With a single glance, one could tell that they were either rich or noble. Their companions were all burly and awe-inspiring, and in the middle of them was a young man and a young woman, each of them riding a majestic Arabian horse. This young man and woman were both wearing embroidered hats, narrow sleeves, and a pair of black deerskin boots. Their waists were slim and their backs were slender, giving them an elegant demeanor. The young man was tall and slender, with a slender waist and arms like an ape's. His eyes were bright like the stars, and his nose was sharp. When he smiled, 2 dimples would appear on his cheeks. He was charming, but he couldn't help but diminish some of the heroic aura of a man. The young woman was a little shorter than him and had a petite figure. She had bright eyes and white teeth, and because she was dressed in men's clothing, she seemed even more charming. This pair of youths were Yang Fan and Tinino. Next to them was a large horse, and on the back of the horse was a leopard. The beast tamer followed closely behind the leopard. They stopped by the Luo River, looking as if they were also here to enjoy the scenery and have a picnic. As luck would have it, the spot they chose was right between those 2 tents. Note, In the Tang dynasty, leopard tamers would often ride on horseback when they went hunting with their masters. Chapter 46. Yang Fan and Tin Eno's party hurried to the banks of the Luo River and stopped. The servants began to get busy. Several large men took out poles and began to set up the tents. Others unloaded bamboo mats, felt blankets, and various other utensils from their carriages and began to set up the tents. Their arrival did not attract Madame Yao's attention. There were many people who came to the Luo River to sightsee, so who had the leisure to pay attention to just who had set up the tents next to them? The tents set up by Yang Fan's party were between two families of tourists who had come to enjoy the autumn scenery. To their right was Madame Yao's tent, while to their left was another group of tourists. Within this tent, 3 women were currently sitting on felt blankets, playing a drinking game. The servants stood around respectfully, waiting upon him. In the middle of the 3 women, there was a tortoise made of jade. The tortoise was carrying a candle-shaped tube on its back. The entire tortoise and the candle-shaped tube were carved from a single piece of jade. The tube was also engraved with lotus-shaped buttons. Within the tube was a long jade token. One of the women took one out and glanced at the words engraved on the token. She smiled and said, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself. Release. Ha! I don't need to drink this round." Although this woman was beautifully dressed and skillfully applied makeup, it still could not conceal her old age. It was only because she had taken good care of her skin that her skin was rather tender. Coupled with the fact that she wore a black wig that covered her head of white hair, she appeared somewhat younger. However, time spared no one. After all, she was a woman over 60 years of age. The wrinkles on her face were as clear as the carvings on the turtle's back. The other 2 women were different. These 2 women seemed to be in their 20s. They were charming and incomparably beautiful. One of the young women reclined on the couch. She wore a large red peony gown, a white muslin gown, and a pink daffodil flower and green leaf skirt. The skirt was wrinkled, and when the sunlight shone on it, it seemed like the snowy moonlight spilled onto the ground, making her graceful and gentle figure seem even more alluring. This mature and charming woman was not dressed like the old woman. Her beautiful black hair was only tied up with a hairband. 2 strands of hair fell over her slender shoulders, making her slightly wide and somewhat rigid chin appear pointy, giving her a charming and playful air. Her forehead was broad and fair, as if it was inlaid with a beautiful piece of jade. Especially her skin. It was snow white and tender like a newborn baby, and that pair of rosy and plump lips made her look even more tender and alluring. The autumn wind blowing from the Luo River carried the fragrance of osmanthus, and from time to time it would gently lift her skirt, allowing her smooth and jade-like legs to sneak out for a breath of fresh air. The other woman was different from this incomparably beautiful woman. Her appearance, temperament, and clothing were like that of a young woman, but also like that of a young woman. It was very difficult to accurately judge. She wore a plain white gown, a watery green grass pleated skirt, and a white brocade belt was tied around her slender waist. Her black, jade-like hair was simply coiled into a flying immortal bun, with only a white plum blossom hairpin in it. With her long and elegant neck, she was both simple and noble. Her appearance was very elegant, and she was originally a beauty, but compared to the extremely charming red-clothed young woman next to her, her appearance paled in comparison. However, her body had a special kind of womanly scent, soft and gentle, the kind of scent that could directly drill into one's heart. The most beautiful was not necessarily the most feminine, but she was full of feminine scent. Her facial features and figure seemed to cater to the tastes of men, giving people a feeling of wanting to love and protect her at first sight. The white, wide forehead and charming young woman did not pay attention to the old woman's laughter. She slightly raised her head and listened to the shouts and neighs of horses outside the tent. She frowned slightly and said unhappily, "Why can't even this place be peaceful?" The woman in plain white gown laughed and said, why bother with him? The autumn air is refreshing, and there are naturally many tourists. We will just enjoy ourselves. As she said this, her white hand lightly stretched out and took out a jade chip from the jade tube. After a careful look, it was engraved with the words, "Having a friend come from afar is not a joyous occasion." 5 points for the honored guest. The woman in plain white gown said sweetly, "Having a friend come from afar is not a joyous occasion. Ha! This is the will of heaven. Ling Yu, you should drink half a cup." The red-clothed young woman lazily picked up the jasper cup and gently sipped half a cup of wine. She put down the cup and casually picked up a cup. Like a Persian cat, she squinted her eyes and glanced up. She said, "The way is not good. Floating on the sea, I drink 10 points. Ah, today this wine has chosen my family." The old woman in her 60s, sitting above her, laughed loudly. She raised the wine pot and attentively filled the jasper cup for her. She said with a smile, "Today's banquet was originally set up for you to relax. Even the heavens have sensed our good intentions. Ha! Since it is so, Ling Yu should drink another cup." The red-clothed young woman was not afraid of wine. She picked up the cup and drained it in one gulp. At this time on Yang Fan's side, cloth had been set up, felt blankets were laid out, seats, cushions, and tables were set up. Food boxes were opened, and various kinds of food were placed on the table. Wine, 3 basil milk, cheese, and other drinks were also set up. The wine utensils they used were either gold or silver. The Tangs liked prosperity. They were not afraid of wearing red or purple, and they did not dislike gold and silver. They were afraid that when the word gold was mentioned, it would be tainted with vulgar hypocrisy. There was no market for this in the Tangs. An octagonal golden cup, decorated with the image of a barbarian, and a silver plate engraved with complex geometric patterns were placed on the table. The gold and silver light reflected off each other, making it look magnificent. Yang Fan stood by the side of the tent with his arms crossed. He glanced at Madame Yao's tent on the right and asked Chu Kuanga with a smile, "Brother Chu, what are your brothers best at?" Chu Kuanga didn't understand his intentions for a moment, so he said, "About this. To tell you the truth, my brothers are all thieves, and most of what they learn are not elegant things. I wonder what brother is referring to." Chu Kuanga was not stupid. Yang Fan had used his men to inquire about Madame Yao and Lu Juanfan's every move. Now that they had followed Madame Yao here, Chu Kuanga knew that they must have something up their sleeves. Chu Kuanga even had some doubts about their identities as the Western region's tyrants. However, it was not important whether Xia Hoing was the real daughter of a Western region's rich and powerful family. What was important was that the salary she paid him was genuine. They, the ruffians, had to stand up for others when necessary to seek revenge and eliminate disasters. Why should they care about her identity? Therefore, Chu Kuanga was happy to pretend that he did not know anything. As long as the other party's actions did not seriously violate the laws of the country and implicate his brothers, he would not ask. Xia Hoing and Yang Fan seemed to see that he had already suspected their identities, but they did not point it out or make any further attempts to cover it up. The two sides maintained a subtle, tacit understanding. Yang Fan said leisurely, "Brother Chu, please do not be angry if I say something. What people in the streets are best at should be provoking trouble and fighting, right?" Chu Kuanga's expression changed slightly. "Why do you say that, brother? After we were hired by Miss Xiaoho, we have never caused trouble." Yang Fan interrupted him and raised his chin at the people who were cooking food and wrestling in full swing. He said, "I am not blaming Brother Chu's brothers for causing trouble. I just see that those people are enjoying themselves and are very boring. Why don't you let your men go over and have some fun?" Chu Kuanga glanced at the people on Madame Yao's side and couldn't help but feel enlightened. As expected, Yang Fan was going to cause trouble. Chu Kuanga's eyes revealed a faint smile as he calmly replied, "If it was anything else, I really wouldn't dare to pat my chest and guarantee that they would be able to accomplish it. As for provoking trouble and fighting, Chu Kwanga sighed softly and said leisurely, I really can't think of anyone who can do better than them. Chapter 47. On the sand, two strong men were wrestling. A blanket was spread on the sandy ground to serve as the competition ground. Two strong men had a piece of cloth around their waists, and they wore a headscarf on their heads. Apart from that, there was nothing else. The two of them were plump and strong. The thick and heavy carpet under their feet twisted and deformed because of their exertion. On the side, there were a few servants and maids watching with great interest. Inside the tent, Yao Sherforen and a few of her noble women were either sitting or lying down, eating fruits and laughing as they watched the performance. These matrons were well aware of the relationship between Lu Junfan and Madame Yao. In front of them, there was no need for the two of them to hide anything. Thus, Lu Junfan sat cross-legged on the table, allowing Madame Yao to rest her head on his thigh. He peeled the grapes and placed them into her mouth, serving her meticulously. On Yang Fan's side, a few people dressed up as slaves received Chu Kwanga's orders and gradually came to the side of the wrestling field. They laughed and commented, pointing and commenting. When the two strong men saw that the audience had increased, they fought even harder. These two people were not professional sumo wrestlers, but servants of a rich and powerful family. In this season, playing polo, bow kicking, sumo wrestling, hunting, and so on were the usual games of the rich and powerful. Therefore, when a master hired a servant, he would pay attention to selecting someone who was skilled in this area. In order to gain favor, the servant would also pay attention to learning and training in this area. Therefore, these sports were very common in the eastern capital, Luoyang. There, sumo wrestlers were also very good at it. The hoodlums only watched for a while before they started laughing and laughing. San Lang, look at that guy. His lower body is unstable and his arms are weak. How dare he come to sumo with such trash? With only one hand, I can make him tumble thrice. Haha, look at the other one. He's even worse. He's exerting all his strength, but he still can't gain the upper hand. How embarrassing. This kind of soft-footed shrimp, if he were on the couch, he definitely wouldn't be able to subdue a woman, and he still has the nerve to come to sumo wrestling. Forget it, let's not watch anymore, it's so boring. The more the two men heard, the angrier they became. Suddenly they shouted and separated to the left and right. The tall, round-faced man glared at the ruffians and shouted, Since you look down on our skills, do you dare to come down and have a match with me? The other man slowly retreated to the side of the field, folding his arms and laughing coldly. Chu Kwanga had already followed the ruffians to the side and was waiting for these words. As soon as the man finished speaking, he smiled proudly, took off his shirt and threw it to one of his brothers. He then kicked off his shoes and walked onto the carpet with his shoulders swaying. What, you're not convinced? Let me teach you what real sumo wrestling is like. When the man saw Chu Kwanga's majestic figure and bulging muscles, his eyes couldn't help but shrink. He cautiously took 2 steps back, slightly bent his waist, and opened his arms. He stared at Chu Kwanga's movements with bright eyes. The women in the tent, who had been watching the fight with indifference, became interested when they saw that their opponents had been changed. They all sat up and looked out. Madame Yao also sat up from Lu Junfan's lap. When she saw Chu Kwanga's strong muscles, her eyes lit up and she praised with interest, "What a big man!" Lu Junfan was jealous and quickly flashed out of the tent. She sternly scolded, "Whose family servants are you? How can you be so unruly? Tell your master to come up and talk." Madame Yao stared at Chu Kwanga's bulging muscles and laughed. "Xiao Lu, stand to the side and don't disturb my mood. What's the harm in telling them to compete?" Lu Junfan had no choice but to retreat to the side. When the man saw that Chu Kwanga's physique was strong, he knew that he wouldn't be easy to deal with. Originally, he only wanted to make a move because of his pride. Now that even his mistress was paying attention to him, he couldn't help but feel nervous. He opened his arms and cautiously waited for Chu Kwanga to make a move. Who would have thought that Chu Kwanga didn't make a move and only stood there steadily, beckoning him with his pinky finger? When the man saw Chu Kwanga's disdainful action, he couldn't help but fly into a rage. With a roar, he pounced forward with his eyes wide open. Although Chu Kwanga's attitude seemed frivolous, he was actually extremely cautious. When he saw him coming, he immediately lowered his tiger back, and with a roar, he sped up to meet him. With a muffled paw sound, the two mountains of flesh collided. Sumo wrestling was actually a type of wrestling. When Yang Fan was in Nanyang, he had also learned wrestling. Although the rules were somewhat different from sumo wrestling, they were mostly similar. The two people in front of him were both proficient in sumo wrestling, and their wrestling techniques were very outstanding. Yang Fan watched with relish, and combined it with the wrestling techniques he had learned from his master. He quickly tasted the flavor of sumo wrestling. Sumo wrestlers were tall and fat and had boundless strength. Although this was an advantage, technical movements and body agility were the key to victory. The tall and fat person might not necessarily win. Otherwise, there would be no need for both sides to compete. As long as they weighed each other and measured each other's height, wouldn't the outcome be decided? Although Chu Kwanga wasn't as fat as the strong man, he was still extremely strong. Furthermore, his sumo wrestling technique was even better than the strong man's. Using all of his strength, good sumo wrestling technique, being able to grasp the right timing and perfectly coordinating the use of leg strength and waist strength. These key factors allowed him to gain the upper hand as soon as they exchanged blows. Although the strong man was fat to the point where he seemed to be able to fit Chu Kwanga's entire body in, he couldn't gain the slightest advantage in front of him. If it wasn't for the fact that Chu Kwanga didn't understand how big of a situation Yang Fan was trying to make and didn't want to end the battle quickly, the strong man would have lost long ago. Even so, after the strong man threw himself left and right, gasping for breath, Chu Kwanga also felt impatient. He suddenly stepped forward, tripped his feet, and pushed with both palms. The strong man lost his balance and staggered back a few steps. His body slanted, and he hurriedly used his right hand to support himself from the ground to stabilize his body. But in sumo wrestling, this was already considered a loss. The strong man stood up, and with a face full of shame, he cupped his fists and said, "I lost." Chu Kwanga calmly stood there, and his eyes glanced at the other strong man. When the strong man saw Chu Kwanga's sumo wrestling ability, he couldn't help but be secretly shocked. His ability was not much different from the strong man who had just been defeated. If he were to go forward, he would only be defeated. Unfortunately, his mistress and the other noble ladies were watching from inside the tent, and if he were to stop now, it would definitely make the mistress unhappy. The strong man secretly hated Chu Kwanga, but the other party's provocation was very strong. At this moment, if he pretended to be deaf and mute and turned a blind eye, he would be disliked by his mistress. Helpless, the strong man could only brace himself and stand up, and loudly said, "Just now you all spoke arrogantly and ridiculed us two brothers. Now that my brother has already fought with you, shouldn't I challenge one of you?" Chu Kwanga was startled when he heard this. Just now, although he had easily won, he had also estimated the strength of the other side. Although they weren't very brilliant, with just a few rotten melons under him, he was afraid they wouldn't be a match for them. However, since the other side had asked him to choose an opponent, how could he refuse? Chu Kwanga thought, "In any case, Brother Yang only told us to provoke a conflict between the two sides. He didn't say who would win or lose. Since our goal has been achieved, why should we care about winning or losing?" With a hearty smile, he retreated to the side and said, "All right, you can choose any of my brothers. Who do you want to compete with?" As soon as Chu Kwanga said this, his brothers immediately puffed out their chests. These fellows were all brave and ruthless men, and whenever they saw a fight, their hands and feet would itch. They only wanted to fight to their heart's content, regardless of who won or lost. Unexpectedly, The strong man's words caused the servants and maids on his side to become dissatisfied. The Tang people worshipped heroes, and the strong man's actions clearly showed that he was bullying the weak and fearing the strong, which made them feel very disgraced. They also belonged to different masters, so they didn't care about the Yao family's strong man's face at all, so they immediately booed. The strong man had just received Chu Kuanga's agreement and was secretly delighted. Hearing his own people constantly ridiculing him, he was ashamed and angry and had the idea of breaking the jar. He originally wanted to find a strong person from Chu Kuanga's side to fight, and if he won, he could at least save some face. But now that he heard the booing, he knew that no matter who won or lost, he would lose face, so he just wanted to vent his anger. His eyes swept over the people around Chu Tinga and suddenly pointed a finger, saying loudly, "Him, I'll fight him!" Yang Fan was standing in the crowd, watching the excitement with a smile, but he didn't expect that the man would point a finger at him. Yang Fan looked around and then said in surprise, "Me?" The strong man gritted his teeth and said fiercely, "Yes, you." Chapter 48. As soon as the strong man said this, the onlookers immediately went into an uproar. Yang Fan was 17 years old. He was tall and slender, and his face was handsome. He looked like a young girl. He was handsome, but he was not at all mighty and majestic. On the other hand, the big man's thighs were thicker than Yang Fan's waist. If they fought, would it still be a contest of skills? It would be a one-sided trampling. Shameless. Too shameless. How can you have the nerve to compete with that young man? Before Chu Tianga's people could say anything, the maids behind the strong man were the first to speak. Look at this lovely young man. He was so charming that they wanted to swallow him with water. If he was trampled by this big man who looked like a mountain of flesh, how miserable would he be? The women all raised their arms and shouted, "Wang Rafeng, you're so shameless. How old is the young man? You have the nerve to challenge him. Wang Rafeng, if you can't do it, just admit defeat. Don't be so shameless." This Wang Rafeng was the second in command. Those who were familiar with him usually called him Wang Er. At this moment, the maids and maids of the madams had all defected to Yang Fan, so they directly called him out by name and did not stand on ceremony. Chu Tinga's brothers were about to protest, but when they saw that they had turned against each other, they did not say anything. Wang Rafeng gritted his molars and tightened his face. He did not make a sound. He only stared at Yang Fan and sneered. Yang Fan touched the back of his head and said shyly, "Since this uncle wants to compete then, I'll give it a try." Chu Kuanga rushed to his side and said worriedly, "This man is tall and strong. Can you do it?" Yang Fan looked at Wang Rafeng, who was like a mountain of flesh. Wang Rafeng had a fierce face and was looking at him with a sneer. Yang Fan tightened his belt, stretched the corner of his clothes, and said to Chu Kuanga without confidence, "I think it should be fine. This uncle looks very friendly. I don't think he will make things too difficult for me." Yang Fan had never pretended to be so honest in front of Chu Kuanga. Naturally, Chu Kuanga did not believe that Yang Fan was a country bumpkin who had never seen the world. Seeing his charmingly naive appearance, he knew that he must have something to rely on, so he relaxed and said, "All right, then be careful yourself. Go." Yang Fan hurriedly said, "There's no hurry. Big brother Chu, I still have something to ask you." Chu Kuanga said, "Speak." Yang Fan bashfully asked, "May I ask in sumo wrestling, what can and can't be done? What counts as a loss and what counts as a win?" Chu Kuanga, Wang Rafeng, all the spectators, cough. In sumo wrestling, almost any part of the body can be used. Neck, shoulders, hands, arms, chest, abdomen, waist, knees, legs, feet can all be used under the watchful eyes of the crowd. Chu Kuanga began a surprise training for Yang Fan. You can use pushing, falling, grabbing, pulling, dodging, pressing, tripping, and other movements to control the enemy. When fighting, you can't grab the opponent's waist. You're not allowed to pull the opponent's hair or ears. You're not allowed to twist, hit, kick, or kick the opponent. Also, when fighting, you absolutely cannot leave the area of the competition. Other than your feet, any part of your body that touches the ground is considered to have lost. If two people fall at the same time, the one who falls first loses. If you can push the opponent out, carry him out, or throw him out of the carpet, it will be considered a complete victory. Chu Tinga thought for a moment, then lowered his voice and said, "You've never learned sumo wrestling, and you're at a disadvantage in terms of physique and strength. However, you're nimble. You can try your best to dodge later. If you can't beat him, immediately fall to the ground and admit defeat. Don't let him throw you out of the competition area. That would be a huge loss of face." Seeing Chu Kwanga pulling Yang Fan and earnestly instructing him on how to sumo, even Wang Rafeng was speechless. A maid in green said indignantly, "Wang Rafeng, he doesn't know sumo wrestling at all. You still have the nerve to compete with him?" Wang Rafeng looked embarrassed. The strong man who had just lost a match next to him said, "Nonsense! How many men in our Tang dynasty don't know sumo wrestling at all? This person is so pretentious. It's clear that he's timid and afraid of fighting. He's just putting on a show. If you want to talk about shame, he's the one who's shameful." At this time, Yang Fan had already understood the rules of sumo wrestling. He slowly walked onto the carpet, and the cursing and scolding immediately quieted down. Yang Fan didn't take off his clothes. He only cupped his fists at Wang Rafeng and said in a clear voice, "Hero Wang, I'm Yang Fan. Please advise me." Wang Rafeng roared, "Good. Come on." Wang Rafeng stretched his arms and pounced at Yang Fan like a giant bear. The onlookers' hearts were in their throats. In their hearts, the winner and loser had already been decided. What they were worried about now was not whether Yang Fan would lose, but whether Wang Rafeng would dive down and crush this handsome young man into a meat patty. At this time, Tin Eno took advantage of the fact that everyone was paying attention to the movements on the field to walk out of the tent. He lightly patted the leopard's head and ordered it to return to the tent. Then he leisurely walked over. When Madame Yao saw the young man walking onto the field, she couldn't help but make a fuss and said, "Io, what a handsome young man! What is he trying to show off? My Wang heir can throw him out with one hand, but he doesn't want his face to hit the ground first and break his skin. It's such a pity for him." A woman at the side covered her sleeves and laughed. "He looks tender like a young chicken. If you like him, quickly tell Wang heir to be lenient." Madame Yao said in a frivolous manner, "What's so good about a young chicken? It looks good, but it's useless. It's better to make soup from an old chicken. It's nourishing to drink and chewy to eat." He, this is what you don't understand. A young chicken is very nutritious. Come on, it'll be sad if you can't go up or down. As Madame Yao spoke, her pair of watery eyes glanced at Chu Kwanga, who was staring at Yang Fan and was ready to help at any time. "I'm not afraid of the capital governor in life, and I'm not afraid of the king of hell in death. Look, even his tattoo is so valiant. If I were to be hugged by such a pair of strong arms." Madame Yao subconsciously clenched her legs, and her face was flushed. Lu Junfan was standing outside, but her ears were listening to the movements inside the tent. When she heard this, she couldn't help but curse in her heart. Shameless woman! Not to mention that you're like a wolf and it's getting harder and harder to satisfy you. And now you're blaming me for not serving you well? Humph! At your age where you're like a wolf and tiger, which man would be able to stand you? Lu Junfan was gritting her teeth and cursing when she suddenly heard a pleasant woman's voice. "Ah, isn't this the Lu family's Lang Jun?" Lu Junfan turned her head and saw a person in front of her. She was wearing an embroidered hat, a narrow-sleeved gown with a lapel collar, and a pair of deerskin boots. Her skin was smooth and clear, and her face was as tender as a lotus flower. Her eyebrows were like willows, and she was really delicate and charming. Lu Junfan couldn't help but be surprised and happy as she said, "Miss Xiaohou, why are you here?" At this time, on the carpet, Wang Rufeng roared and pounced at Yang Fan again. He closed his arms, and the mountains of flesh on his body rose up. It looked like if Yang Fan was hugged by his arms, he would suffocate to death. Yang Fan didn't imitate Chu Tinga and forcefully collided with him. There was a huge difference in weight between them. Martial arts could make a person strong, and it could also make a person nimble. But this kind of difference in weight and physical strength couldn't be ignored. Since Yang Fan had martial arts skills, there was no need for him to use this kind of stupid method of killing 1,000 people at the expense of 800. However, he couldn't use too high a level of martial arts in front of everyone's eyes. Thus, he only flicked his legs and narrowly dodged the moment Wang Rufeng's thick arms were about to close in. This was the third time he had avoided fighting. The strong man on the side booed again and again to boost Wang Er's momentum. In Wang Rufeng's view, compared to Chu Kuanga, this Yang Fan in front of him didn't need to show any skills at all. He just needed to pick this person up and throw him out of the competition area. In the end, 3 attacks in a row, a push, a bump, and a hug, were all dodged by Yang Fan relying on his agility. He couldn't help but feel anxious, seeing that after 3 attacks, Yang Fan had been forced to the edge of the carpet. Wang Rufeng was secretly happy and pounced forward. Taking advantage of the time when Yang Fan was retreating again, his body flashed and firmly locked onto him. At this time, Yang Fan had been forced to a corner of the carpet. Wang Rufeng sneered and reached out to grab him. According to Wang Rufeng's intention, he wanted to grab Yang Fan's belt and throw him out. Yang Fan only wanted to test his sumo techniques, but he found that other than his heavy body, he had no redeeming qualities in terms of technique or speed. He didn't have the patience to continue grinding and actually made a move at the same time. At this time, Yang Fan still did not reveal his true martial arts. He spun around, and his body was as slippery as oil. Wang Rufeng's palm slid past his lapel. Yang Fan's figure stabilized, and he had already moved to the side. Wang Rufeng stretched out his palm to grab the position he had predicted. His ribs were wide open, and Yang Fan pushed out with both palms. With just a light push, Wang Rufeng's huge body flew out, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. Chapter 49. Hey, hey, hey! Wang Rufeng let out a strange cry as his body flew more than 10 feet away before crashing to the ground. A mountain of flesh quickly collapsed, and the ground trembled a few times. For a moment, mud and sand flew up, and cheers sounded from all directions. In sumo, as long as the opponent's body touched the ground, it would be considered a win. However, the most brilliant winning move was to hit the opponent out of the ring. Among the methods to hit the ring, one could grab the opponent's belt, turn around, and use inertia to throw the opponent out of the ring. One could also rely on their powerful strength to pick up the opponent and throw them out of the ring. The most exaggerated method was Yang Fan's. Through a palm strike or a headbutt, he would suddenly send the opponent flying with a forceful collision. Although Yang Fan's forceful collision actually had an element of trickery in it, it was not against the rules. Besides, how many of the spectators could understand what was going on? They only saw Wang Rufeng pounce over. Yang Fan step back and throw a mountain of flesh out of the ring with both palms. Good, good. Beta Persei, you're really amazing. Chu Kuanga's brothers on his side all cheered, even the servants and families of the noblewomen, except for the servants of Madame Yao, all cheered. The other strongman saw that Wang Rufeng was like a lion pouncing on a rabbit. He was waiting to see Yang Fan fall to the ground with a bloody nose and a swollen face. Who would have thought that in an instant the outcome of the battle would be reversed? The one who fell to the ground in a sorry state was actually Wang Rufeng, causing him to be dumbfounded. Chu Kuanga's ruffian brothers did not spare him and took the opportunity to ridicule him. They only used slang from the streets, and none of them were pleasant to listen to. The strong man was so angry that his lungs were about to explode, but he did not know how to deal with them. The other party was a sharp-tongued person, and there were 6 or 7 of them. If they really quarreled, he would not be able to gain the upper hand. Wang Rufeng lay on the ground, feeling dizzy from the fall. It took him a long time to recover. He looked up at the white clouds drifting in the distant and clear sky. He tried hard to recall for a long time, but he didn't know how he fell out. Yang Fan glanced to the side and saw Tin Ano and Lu Junfan talking and laughing as they walked down the forest. He gave Chu Kuanga a look, telling him to delay for a while. Chu Kuanga understood and laughed. He walked over to Wang Rufeng and helped him pat the sand off his body. He said with a smile, "It's hard to avoid mistakes in a contest of skills. It's nothing. My brothers have always been sharp-tongued and are not willing to forgive people. Please don't blame them, Brother Wang." He turned and scolded, "Shut!" As soon as Chu Kuanga said this, his brothers all shut their mouths. Chu Kuanga bowed to the women in the tent and said, "My honored guests, the purpose of this wrestling contest is to relieve your boredom and to have some fun. If I can please you, then that's all. I hope you won't take it to heart. Seeing that many of you noble guests have brought horses with you, I presume that you are also very fond of bowing. It just so happens that my brothers and I are also fond of bowing. Everyone enjoying the autumn scenery by the banks of the Luo River can be considered as fate. Why don't each family send out a few people to have a bow-striking competition? It doesn't matter who wins or loses. It's just to relieve boredom." When Madame Yao saw that the man she admired was speaking, she was already very happy. When she heard him speak politely, she was even happier. Her charming eyes wandered over his firm chest, and she smiled. "Fine, I'll offer 1,000 taels as a reward. Madame Feng, Madame Hua, your families will each send out 3 people, and my family will send out 4. Let's have a contest. How about it?" The 2 women only wanted to have fun. They didn't care if their servants won or lost face, or if their bones were broken. They immediately agreed, and both sides began to prepare. Yang Fan didn't understand sumo, let alone bow striking. He had grown up in Southeast Asia, a place where even horses were rare. He didn't know how to ride a horse, so how could he have ever seen bow striking? Because of this, he automatically retreated to the side. Unfortunately, Wang Er had his eyes on him. In the leftmost tent, the women were still having a drinking contest. The younger generation will surpass the older. Haha, this time it's your turn to drink. The young woman in red held a jade chip in her hand as she spoke to the lady in the plain jade gown with a face full of smiles. A maid in a green gown who was standing at the entrance of the tent suddenly giggled and cried out involuntarily, "That dog ate sh*t! What a miserable fall!" The young woman in red raised an eyebrow and asked, "Xiangning, what are you looking at?" The green-robed maid at the entrance of the tent hurriedly turned around and bowed. She giggled and said, "There are 2 families over there who are enjoying the autumn river. They are having a contest of sumo techniques. One of them is as fat as a bear, and the other is as thin as a monkey." This servant thought that the bear would win, but who knew that the monkey would beat the bear? The young woman in red laughed and said, "You stupid girl, why can't you even understand what I'm saying?" She lazily waved her hand and ordered, "Remove the right side of the tent. Let's watch the show." The young woman in red gave the order, and the side of the tent was immediately removed. The bow-kicking game was very popular in the Tang Dynasty. Light cavalry was very popular in the Tang Dynasty. The imperial court paid attention to the training of light cavalry with high speed and good for long-distance attacks. When Li Shimin found out that the Tubo people played polo, he promoted the sport in the Tang Dynasty. When the Tubo ambassador found out that Tang Taizong liked polo, he specially gave him a polo as a gift. However, Li Shimin didn't want the Tubo people to know his true intentions, so he pretended not to like it and burned the polo. But after that, the game of polo became popular in the Tang Dynasty. Nowadays, the nobles, scholars, and soldiers all like to play polo. Even the daughters of the noble families and the palace maids in the imperial city were good at polo. However, most people couldn't afford a horse and rarely had the chance to ride a horse. Therefore, they weren't good at riding, so they played polo. Polo was kuju and polo was bow kicking. Nowadays, the imperial family built polo fields in various palaces. Some high officials also built polo fields near their mansions. The polo fields they built were slightly wider than modern standard football fields, but the length was slightly shorter. The total area was about the same size as a football field, but the quality of the construction was extremely exquisite. From the top, it looked like a mountain, and from the bottom, it looked like a mirror. In order to make the ground smooth and flexible, so that grass wouldn't grow in summer and it wouldn't freeze in winter, some rich and powerful families didn't even hesitate to spend huge amounts of money to pour buckets of oil onto the field. With so much effort, it could be seen how much the upper class liked to play polo at that time. Their obsession with polo was no less than the love of modern people for football, and it might even surpass it. Of course, this temporary field couldn't be so particular. They used the poles left over from the tent to make the goal, and drew lines on the sand to make the field. The field was a bit smaller than a normal field, so using the local materials, it was quickly set up. The players from both sides were also neatly dressed, ready to enter the field. At this time, there was a maximum of 10 people on each side, but there was no minimum limit. In other words, the number of players on both sides was not required to be exactly the same. If you wanted to, one person could take on 10 people on the other side, and no one would care. Although there were many people on Chu Kwanga's side, there were only 5 people who knew how to play polo. Yang Fan and the others who didn't know how to play polo helped to tie the ponytails one by one. Wang Rufeng was thrown miserably by Yang Fan just now. In his mind, Yang Fan said he didn't know anything about sumo at the beginning, and then asked Chu Kwanga to explain the rules to him on the spot. He was deliberately showing weakness and tricking him. Now that he had lost a lot of face, he hated Chu Kwanga to the core. Now that he saw that Yang Fan didn't prepare a horse for the competition, he guessed that he really wasn't good at horsemanship. Wang Rufeng's eyes darted around, and he whispered a few words to a polo player who was also in Yao Manor. That person nodded slightly and walked over with his horse. He said to Yang Fan, "Little brother, your sumo skills are so superb, so your bowing skills must also be extraordinary. I would like to experience your skills. How about it?" Yang Fan smiled. "I'm ashamed. I don't know how to ride a horse, and I don't know how to bow." That person looked up to the sky and laughed, but there wasn't a trace of a smile on his face. He said coldly, "Just now you said you don't know anything about sumo, but in the end, didn't you still beat Wang Er cleanly? As a man, being too humble is hypocritical." Yang Fan didn't care about winning or losing. He sneaked a glance and saw Tin Ano and Lu Junfan chatting under a row of trees in the distance. Thinking that as long as he could stall for time and attract Madame Yao's attention, he would be fine. He smiled and replied in a good mood, "I really don't know how to bow, but since this brother has requested it, I will give it a try." Chapter 50. Chu Kwanga heard their conversation. After that person walked away, he immediately approached Yang Fan and comforted him. "Don't worry, this isn't a one-on-one challenge. We only have 5 people on the field. Although you're not good at archery, it doesn't matter if you're one more person. You just have to sit on your horse and pretend. Winning or losing has nothing to do with you." The archery began. Archery goals were divided into 2 types, single goal and double goal. A single goal was a small hole about a foot wide under a wooden wall. Behind the hole was a net, and the outcome was determined by the number of goals scored by each team. Generally, women were better at using a single goal because there was less movement on the field with a single goal. The double goal was similar to modern times. Both sides would each set up a goal that was more than 10 feet high, and the winner would be the ball that hit the opponent's goal. The balls used for archery were bright red and the size of a fist. They were made of hardwood, and the ball staves were about 10 feet long with a crescent at the top. Yang Fan also took a ball stave and flipped onto a horse. Wang Rufeng held the ball and stood in the center line. He raised the red ball high in his hand and glanced at both sides. Suddenly he tossed it up. The red ball first rose and then fell to the ground. Before the red ball hit the ground, Chu Kwanga and one of the opposing players shouted and urged their horses forward. With a whoosh, the crescent moonwood staves in their hands struck the vermilion ball at the same time. My father and brother went to Yangzhou. I was suffering from a cold at the time, so I didn't go with them. Now that my father and brother haven't returned, I'm bored alone in Luoyang, so I walked around the city to relax. I didn't see much of the scenery of the Central Plains, but I did see a real Central Plains character. Xiaoying looked back at Lu Junfan with a smile and said affectionately. Lu Junfan was very pleased with the beauty's praise, but he pretended to be humble and said repeatedly, I'm ashamed. I really don't deserve your praise. Not at all, Xiaoying replied. I've been going around Luoyang recently and seen a few local people, but this is the first time I've seen someone as elegant and handsome as you. This Western region woman didn't seem to hide her appreciation and affection for Lu Junfan. Such praise coming from such a delicate, rich, and noble girl was simply like the voice of a fairy. Lu Junfan's heart felt as if it was floating, but his face was indifferent. He brushed his clothes in a natural and unrestrained manner and said with a smile, You flatter me, you really flatter me. I heard that Dunhuang has 16 major surnames, and one of them is the Xiahou family. Young lady, you are. Xiaoying smiled. Lang Jun, you are truly knowledgeable to even know this. In fact, there were more than 16 great families in the Western region. For thousands of years, the great families had risen and fallen. Some families had fallen, while others had risen. The number of ups and downs had never been fixed. My family can barely be considered a great family in the Dunhuang area. It's nothing much, just a few more relatives and more land, cattle, and sheep. It really is the Xiahou family of Dunhuang. No wonder you can spend so much money, 200,000 for a cup of wine. Lu Junfan was very excited. At that time, commerce was flourishing, and the main trade route of the Tang dynasty was the Silk Road. Therefore, the Tang people were most familiar with the customs of the Western region. Lu Junfan had heard that Dunhuang had more than 10 great families, including the Suo family, the Zhang family, the Chao family, the Li family, the Yin family, and the Xiahou family. All of them were rich enough to rival a country. These families had herds of cattle and sheep, over 10,000 warhorses, and as many servants as the clouds. They had a large number of pastures and shepherds, which indirectly meant that they had a large army. They also did business, but their status was different from the lowly merchants of the Central Plains. They were practically the local tyrants. The imperial court had always used the policy of keeping these great families far away from the emperor, using both kindness and authority. Therefore, these families were considered to be of high status in the Tang dynasty, enjoying a high political status. This beautiful girl who had faintly developed feelings for him was actually the Xiahou family of Dunhuang. Lu Junfan's heart warmed. She said excitedly, I saw that this young lady has a beautiful heart and an extraordinary temperament. I knew that you were an extraordinary person, but I didn't expect you to be from the Xiahou family of Dunhuang. A person like this young lady is like a fairy who has been banished to the mortal world. Your father must be an extraordinary person in the Xiahou family. Xiaoying covered her mouth and laughed. Lang Jun has a good eye. My father is the leader of the Xiahou family. Lu Junfan was secretly shocked. The leader of the Xiahou family. In other words, the little beauty in front of him was equivalent to a princess in the Dunhuang region. How could a person of such status favor him so much? Lu Junfan was overwhelmed by the unexpected favor and began to pay more attention to her demeanor. Lu Junfan coughed and said politely, Actually, Luoyang is located between the rivers and Luoyang in the middle of the world. To the north is Mount Mang, to the south is Yik, to the east is Hulao, and to the west is Hangzhou. It is surrounded by mountains and stands in great numbers. It has the reputation of being the capital of the world, surrounded by mountains and rivers. Luoyang oppresses Zhanghuai to the east, Guanlong to the west, Yuan to the north, and Jingxiang to the south. It is the dragon's vein of the Central Plains. Not only does it have the honest and majestic aura of the Central Plains, it also has the charming and romantic qualities of the southern water villages. Therefore, it has the great beauty of heaven and earth, becoming the divine capital that is admired by all. There were a lot of scenic spots and places of interest. Although this young lady has been to a few places, I haven't seen any of them. It must be because I don't have a guide and don't know where the scenic spots are. If this young lady doesn't mind, I am willing to be your guide and accompany you on a tour of Luoyang. What does this young lady think? Good. This is my wish, but I don't dare to ask. Xiaohou smiled like a flower and happily said, When I was in Dunhuang, I often heard people say that the Central Plains is a place of outstanding people. But ever since I came to the Central Plains, I have only met people who reek of money. Lang Jun is the only handsome young man that I have seen so far. At this point, Xiaohou hesitated for a moment, her face blushing. She lowered her head and asked in a small voice, I wonder, Lang Jun, are you married? Lu Juanfan's heart thumped. An unimaginable thought immediately jumped out. Could it be that this Miss Xiaohou was planning to? Lu Junfan didn't have time to think too much. He hurriedly answered, I have studied hard since I was young, wholeheartedly seeking scholarly fame. I am infatuated with my studies, so I have yet to marry. As soon as these words came out, Miss Xiaohou's expression immediately relaxed. An extremely happy expression appeared on her face. Although she immediately turned her head to tidy up the hair on her temples to conceal it, the obvious bashful and happy expression fell into Lu Juanfan's eyes. Lu Juanfan's heart thumped wildly. He forced himself to be calm and said, Please forgive this one for being presumptuous. Young lady cough. Are you married? Not yet. The men of Dunhuang are all vulgar people. How can I like them? Xiaohou said in a low voice. She raised her head shyly and said softly, What I like is a modest young master like Lu Lang, who is as gentle as jade. Although women at this time were bold and unrestrained, they were not excessively straightforward. Xiaohou Ying's words were already a very clear confession. When Lu Junfan heard this, his heart was like a polo ball on the court that had been hit into the air. He was dizzy and swaying, unable to find a place to rest for a long time. On the beach, the bowstroke competition was in full swing. He didn't have the heart to watch it. His mind was completely focused on the beautiful mountain of gold in front of him. Little Lu was already drunk before he drank. Yang Fan had indeed never played polo, let alone rode a horse. So when he arrived on the field, he acted as a decoration. He stopped his horse and stayed motionless, watching the excitement. The main force of the bowstroke was Chu Kuanga and his 4 brothers. However, the other side also saw that he was the weakest link. At the same time, they wanted to make a fool of him. Therefore, they took advantage of numbers and kept a close eye on the others. They only left a gap in the direction of Yang Fan and forced them to pass the ball to Yang Fan. Chu Kuanga and the others knew that Yang Fan didn't know how to play at all, so they were unwilling to pass the ball to him. As a result, they continuously lost the ball. Every time they lost the ball, the 2 sides would change sides and play again. No matter how they changed sides, Yang Fan didn't need to move because he was basically riding a horse on the center line. After a few rounds, the score of the 2 sides had become 5-1. Chu Kuanga's team was trailing by a large margin. This made Chu Kuanga impatient. When he got the ball again, he rushed straight to the opponent's goal, but was blocked by 4 opponents. He had no choice but to give it a try and pass the ball to Yang Fan. Chapter 51. On the other side, Lu Junfan understood the girl's intentions and couldn't help but be overjoyed. With a trembling voice, he called out, "Little girl!" Tin Ano shyly lowered her head and softly said, You're treating me like an outsider. Lang Jun, just call me Xiaoing. Xiao. Xiaoing. Even an idiot would understand her intentions at this time, let alone a man like Lu Junfan who had rolled around in a pile of rouge. Lu Junfan almost fainted from joy. He had never imagined that he would be able to receive the favor of such a rich young lady. He had once heard that the women of Dunhuang were far more unrestrained than the women of the Central Plains. The girls there could choose their own husbands without the consent of their fathers and brothers. As long as the husband was in love and the concubine was interested, the family would allow it. He had also heard that some of the girls of Dunhuang would first live together to try out the marriage. The young lady in front of him was as charming as a flower and as beautiful as jade. Even if it was just a casual marriage, it would be a good thing. Furthermore, with her family background, if he could become husband and wife with her, he, Lu Junfan, would reach the heavens in a single step and become the son-in-law of a wealthy family in Dunhuang. These arrogant and bossy girls from rich families would do anything they wanted to anything they wanted as long as they saw someone or something they liked. The more they couldn't have it, the more they would do anything to get it. Lu Junfan was best at dealing with these kinds of arrogant and willful women. He had no doubt that with his ability to please women, he would definitely win the heart of this Miss Xiaoing. He would have someone to rely on for the rest of his life. Xiaoing. Lu Junfan excitedly reached out to grab Xiaoying's soft hands. Just as he was about to touch those small white hands, Xiaoying suddenly withdrew her hands as if remembering something. She suspiciously asked. That day at the restaurant, Xiaoying saw Lang Jun with a middle-aged woman. Today, I saw the two of you swimming along the Luo River. Judging from her age, she doesn't seem to be your mother. Who is she to you? Lu Junfan's heart skipped a beat. Seeing that the girl's beautiful eyes were staring at him, he became even more anxious. At this moment, his mind was filled with fantasies of climbing up to the rich and powerful. How could he be willing to let his beautiful dream become a bubble? In a moment of desperation, he casually said, "Oh, you're talking about that woman. She's a married woman who lives with me. Her surname is Yao. She can be considered a distant relative of mine. Xiao Sheng's family is poor, so it's not easy for me to study. So while I'm studying, I'm also working as an accountant in Lady Yao's mansion to earn some money. Lady Yao takes good care of Xiao Sheng. Seeing that it's not easy for me to live alone, sometimes when I go out, she often brings me along to see the world." Xiaoying let out a sigh of relief. "Oh, so that was how it was. That's a relief. Ouch. Look, my servant is exchanging greetings with someone else. It's so interesting. Come, Lang Jun, let's go take a look." Lu Junfan was shocked, just as he was about to find an excuse to refuse. Xiaoying grabbed his hand and ran off happily. Holding her hand in his, it was soft and creamy. It was indescribably comfortable. This girl's noble family background, wealth that could rival a country, and alluring beauty made her even more alluring in Lu Junfan's eyes. In order to climb up to the rich and powerful, he didn't hesitate to act like a dog in front of Lady Yao. How could he dare to offend such a beauty? In a daze, he was dragged by Xiaoying to the field. Chu Kuanga passed the ball over. When Yang Fan saw that the ball was in front of him, he had no choice but to use his cane. Unexpectedly, the ball flew out of the court and almost hit the onlookers, causing them to laugh. But when a player on Yang Fan's side was intercepted for the second time and had no choice but to pass the ball to him, Yang Fan struck with his staff again. This time, the ball turned into a stream of light, passing through several players on both sides and accurately landing in front of Chu Tinga's horse. The ball was passed very accurately. What was even rarer was that the person he chose happened to be Chu Tinga, who was rushing back and was far behind the enemy. Chu Tinga received the ball in his hand and took advantage of the enemy's emptiness to score with the ball. The score became 5-2. Almost everyone thought that Yang Fan was a blind cat bumping into a dead mouse, so when the third ball was forced to his feet again, no one would have thought that he would be able to play a good ball again. However, with a swing of his stick, The ball once again chose the right gap and the right person. The score thus became 5-3. This time, everyone believed that he was pretending to be a pig to eat a tiger, and that his so-called inability to play polo was just a pretense. In fact, Yang Fan really didn't know how to play polo, and he really didn't know how to ride a horse. However, he knew how to play sepak. Yang Fan had been living in Nanyang since he was a child, and sepak was a popular ball game in Nanyang countries. Every nation in the world had invented ball games, but the way they played them was different, the rules were different, and the balls were also different. Nanyang sepak was a hollow rattan ball made of rattan branches. The way it was played was very casual. It could be hit with hands, kicked with feet, or hit with a wooden stick. This kind of ball game wasn't very competitive, and it focused on technique. It was simply a game that Nanyang people used to kill time when they were bored. However, because the ball was very light, it required a high degree of ball control skills to be able to use the ball freely. And Yang Fan happened to be a master of sepak. The first ball flew because Yang Fan didn't understand the weight and hardness of the polo ball. But when he hit the ball, he had a plan in mind. When he got the ball the second time, he could quickly adjust his strength and the angle of the ball. Polo was also a kind of sport, and it couldn't be separated from the use of the body's flexibility, coordination, control of strength, the requirements for reaction speed, and the requirements for the ability to analyze and judge. In these aspects, whether Yang Fan was a master of sepak or a martial arts master, he had reached the highest standard of a polo player. What he lacked was not knowing how to ride a horse and being unfamiliar with the staff. However, it was like a Ba Gua Zhang grandmaster turning around and learning the chop hang palm. With his comprehension of martial arts and the physical fitness he had already achieved, he could execute the palm on the spot. A disciple who had already learned the chop hang palm for 3 years would still be left in the dust. Yang Fan only needed to master a little bit of this knowledge to far surpass these non-professional players. Although his horsemanship couldn't be improved immediately, and he couldn't gallop, grab the ball, dribble the ball, or attack. With his eyesight, he could accurately judge the situation of the game and find the opponent's weakness with a quick glance. When the ball was under his staff, he would be able to accurately, steadily, and quickly pass it to the person he wanted to pass. Chu Tienga changed their style of play. With the motionless Yang Fan in the middle of the field, they launched a counterattack. During the attack, any player who was intercepted would immediately pass the ball to Yang Fan. As long as Yang Fan got the ball would accurately pass the opponent to the player who should be the most in possession of the ball, regardless of whether that person was far or near or where he was. For a moment, the situation of the game changed dramatically. The score was quickly caught up, and the gap began to widen. The 10 people on Madame Yao's side were suppressed by the 6 people on Chu Tinga's side, and they didn't even have the strength to fight back. Yang Fan rode in the middle of the field, neither advancing nor retreating. He held his staff horizontally on his saddle. As long as the ball didn't reach him, he wouldn't move, no matter how much the opponent attacked him. But as long as the red ball was in front of his horse or even flew over his head, he would just wave his staff. As long as he waved his staff, it was impossible to intercept his ball, cut his ball, or snatch his ball, because he wouldn't let the ball stay in his hands for a second longer. He would immediately pass the ball to the player who should be in possession of the ball. Later on, as long as the opposing players saw him wave his staff, they would immediately run towards their own goal in a conditioned reflex so that they could intercept the ball in time. As for Yang Fan, once he waved his staff, he acted as if nothing had happened. He held his staff horizontally on the saddle bridge, coldly watching the show from the sidelines. Only I, great General Yang, can leap over a horse with a sword. Although Yang Fan didn't fight for the ball and didn't integrate into the intense competitive atmosphere of polo, he had already stolen the limelight. Everyone wanted to see his magical passing skills, so when his team got the ball, the audience immediately shouted, "Pass it to him! Pass it to him!" When Yang Fan got the ball and waved his staff, there was a burst of fanatical cheers. All the audience was conquered by his magical passing skills. The Tangs loved polo and Yang Fan had now become the god of ball in the hearts of the audience. As the game developed, all the efforts of both sides were just to pave the way for his comet-like skills. The fanatical fans only cheered for Yang Fan. Surround him, force him to dribble the ball. Wang Rufeng stood on the edge of the field, his hands clasped into a trumpet, and he shouted angrily to the people on the field. Another ball was passed to Yang Fan's feet. The moment the ball was passed, several opposing players rushed over and surrounded Yang Fan. The other members of the opposing team were staring at Yang Fan's companions. Due to the tight encirclement of the opposing players, Yang Fan's vision was blocked, and it was difficult for him to accurately pass the ball to his own players. If he didn't dribble the ball to break out of the encirclement, he could only swing his staff and hit the ball over the heads of the opposing players. In this way, it was difficult to guarantee who the ball would be passed to. The cheers of the audience stopped. Everyone wanted to see how the god of ball in their hearts was going to deal with this situation. They wanted to see if his miracle staff would create another miracle. They hoped that Yang Fan didn't know how to ride a horse was also a disguise, just like how he didn't know how to play ball. If at this time Yang Fan suddenly urged his horse to gallop, dribble the ball, and charge straight to the opponent's goal, they would not be surprised, nor would they curse. They would only roar and cheer for him. Under everyone's eyes, Yang Fan moved. Chapter 52. Yang Fan did not use his stirrups to spur the horse forward with the ball. He still waved his cane, and he actually only waved his cane. Yang Fan waved his cane, and the polo ball swept over the heads of the opposing players surrounding him. It turned into a rainbow light and drew an arc, like a comet, across the sky. Everyone raised their heads and looked into the sky. Their eyes followed the movement of the red light. From the moment the ball flew out, everyone knew from the angle that it was not going to be passed to anyone. Could it be that Yang Fan knew that the ball could not be accurately passed, so he deliberately sabotaged it and wanted the ball to go out of bounds? Immediately after, they were dumbfounded to find that the shadow that had turned into a red stream of light was actually flying straight towards the opponent's goal, standing in the midfield and shooting directly. This play was beyond everyone's expectations. Yes, the field they had randomly drawn on the beach was not very standard, and it was indeed a little smaller than a standard field. But it was not a field where one could directly throw the ball into the goal by standing in the midfield. It should be noted that the balls used to shoot the ball at this time were made of solid hardwood, which had limited elasticity and was relatively heavy. Standing in the center line and waving the cane, it was impossible to hit the ball into the opponent's goal, even if you were a Hercules, because if your strength was too great, it would only break the crescent-shaped tip of the cane, or the solid wood ball could not withstand the force and would shatter with one blow. However, Yang Fan did it. He waved his cane, and the ball turned into a stream of light. Under everyone's stunned eyes, it shot directly into the opponent's goal. This was not something that could be done with infinite strength. The arm's strength must be great, and it must be skillful. The ball was not hit out, but was picked up by the cane and thrown out when it was rotated to an angle where it was easiest to exert force. Only this could explain why the cane was in good condition, and the ball was not broken, but could be hit so far. However, when picking up the ball, one must be gentle, and when throwing the ball, one must be firm. The subtle use of strength depended on one's heart, and this was not something that could be done just by understanding its principles. The ball flew into the opponent's goal, bounced a few times on the ground, and rolled out along the sand towards the tents of the women who had been watching them on the other side. The onlookers cheered wildly. The scene of Yang Fan waving his staff to hit the ball, and the ball turned into a stream of light. The moment the staff stopped in the air, the heroic posture was deeply imprinted in their minds. At the edge of the field on Yang Fan's side, every time a goal was scored, a red flag would be planted. The person in charge of the referee was planting a new red flag. The flags on Chu Kuanga's side had already formed a forest. The courage of the opposing players to continue playing was completely crushed by Yang Fan's strike. Amid the thunderous cheers, they reluctantly admitted, "We lost." Well done, Erlang. Chu Kwanga laughed and raised his thumb at Yang Fan. Yang Fan smiled, turned over the horse, and quickly chased after the red ball. The horse, which had not run a single step since the start of the game, snorted loudly, shook its head and wagged its tail as it walked to the side, minding its own business. A gorgeous young woman in a bright red and embroidered robe lay on the soft couch. She held her cheek in one hand, and her other hand that was jade, white like jade, was holding the red ball lightly. Her fingers were slender, and her cardamom-painted nails were very long, exuding an indescribable air of nobility. At this moment, the red ball quietly stopped in her jade-like palm. The ball was illuminated by the sun, and the red light seemed to be able to reflect through the back of her palm. She gently spun the polo ball and carefully examined it. Her eyes could not help but reveal a look of surprise. It was just an ordinary hardwood polo ball. There was nothing special about it. The young man standing in the middle of the field had shot such a wooden polo ball into the goal with one swing of his staff. The beautiful young woman raised her eyebrows in surprise and stared at the young man walking towards them. As soon as Yang Fan arrived in front of the tent, several men in embroidered robes rushed out and stretched out their hands to block his way. These people seemed to be servants, but they were all dressed in embroidered robes, with embroidered belts around their waists and silk headbands on their heads. They exuded an extraordinary air of nobility. Looking at their tall and sturdy figures, and their eyes were faintly shining, it was obvious that they were not easy to get along with. The servants knew the master. If the servants were already acting like this, then the identity of the master could be imagined. Yang Fan knew that these tourists must be extremely noble and influential people. He quickly stood still and bowed deeply, saying, "I made a mistake and hit the ball into the tent. I have alarmed the noble. Please forgive me." The beautiful woman in red, who was lying on her side, smiled faintly and gently shook the hand that was holding the red ball. The men in embroidered robes who were blocking Yang Fan immediately took a few steps back and opened up a path. Yang Fan stepped forward and bowed again from 2 feet away, saying, "I ask the noble to return the polo ball." The beautiful woman smiled faintly and said, "Your equestrian skills are not good." Her voice was slightly hoarse and had a bit of magnetism. When she spoke, her rhythm was reserved and soothing, and she was as beautiful as the clouds. Yang Fan smiled. "I will not hide it from the noble. I have never learned to ride a horse." A strange light flashed in the beautiful woman's eyes. She asked in surprise, "You have never learned to ride a horse? Then how did you train your bow?" Yang Fan said, bowing, "This is also my first time." The beautiful woman's eyes revealed a trace of surprise. She turned back to the woman in white robes and smiled. It is your first time bowing, and you already have such skills. Have you seen it before?" The woman in white robes smiled and said, "I have never seen it before. If this young man isn't lying, he's really a prodigy in archery." The beautiful woman smiled slightly and said with certainty, "He is not lying." As she said this, she turned back and a pair of bright eyes looked at Yang Fan. She asked, "What is your name? Where do you live? What do you do now?" Yang Fan hesitated slightly and decided to tell the truth in front of this beautiful woman. He did not know why, but this beautiful woman's eyes seemed to have the power to see through people's hearts. Yang Fan instinctively felt a sense of threat. There was no need for the other party to ask for his name. Since she asked, she must have a purpose. If he randomly made up a name, once the other party sent people to investigate, it would ruin his plan. But there was no harm in telling her directly because Madame Yao's subordinates were not here. Yang Fan said, "My name is Yang Fan. I am a worker of the Shoin workshop." The beautiful woman in red smiled and said, "Oh, so you are a neighbor. My surname is Li, and I live in the Shangshan workshop." The Shangshan workshop was in front of the Shoin workshop. It was next to the Tianjin Bridge and was the closest to the main gate of the imperial city. Many of the first-class rich and powerful lived in this workshop. Of course, such a large workshop did not only contain the rich and powerful, but also the common people. But looking at her ostentatious appearance and the fact that she lived in the Shangshan workshop, she must be from an extremely rich and powerful family. Yang Fan's heart trembled slightly, and he secretly increased his vigilance. The beautiful woman in red gently turned the red ball in her hand and looked like she was thinking about something. The red ball rotated lightly in her palm. Her clear eyes looked up and she said with a smile, "Even though this is your first time bowing, you have great talent in this area. Being a small worker is really unfair to you. I have the intention of inviting you to join my residence so that you can focus on practicing polo. What do you think?" Yang Fan quickly glanced at the three women sitting there and secretly guessed their identities. He cautiously replied, "I am used to being lazy and am not used to working in a noble's residence." The beautiful woman in red raised her eyebrows and did not speak again. The plain-clothed woman next to her sweetly said, "Little Lang Jun, don't be in a hurry to refuse. This noble is a real noble, a noble beyond words. Haha, if you can gain her favor, it will be a great opportunity for you." Yang Fan smiled and said, "You can't play polo for a lifetime. Even though I am just a worker, my life is stable. I have no ambition and do not seek wealth. I only seek food and clothing. Besides food and clothing, I can obtain freedom. That is enough." The woman in red smiled slightly and said, "Little Lang Jun, don't be in a hurry to confess. Why don't you think about it? If you change your mind, you can go to Shangshan Lane to find me." With a look, a man in a brocade robe handed something to Yang Fan. The thing was heavy in his hand. Yang Fan looked at it and saw that it was a fish talisman made of brass. The fish talisman was carved in the shape of a fish with words engraved on it. It was used in the Tang dynasty to prove the identity of the emperor and officials. It was also known as the waist token during the Song and Ming dynasties. The materials of the fish talisman varied according to the identity of the person. The crown prince used a jade fish talisman, the prince used a gold fish talisman, and the ordinary officials and bodyguards used a copper fish talisman. The waist token in Yang Fan's hand was a copper fish talisman. There was only a big way carved on the front and a small line of words on the back. Escort of Princess Taiping's residence. Yang Fan suddenly raised his head and looked at the beautiful woman in red in surprise. She wore a well-tailored red palace gown made of superior materials, wrapping around her curvaceous and alluring body. The sunlight shone on her glowing dress, making her seem like a mermaid lying on the shore of the Luo River. Was she the princess of the princesses, the flower of Luoyang Lilingyue? Note: Princess Taiping did not leave her name in the history books. The name Lilingyue was just a rumor. For convenience, this name was used in the story. It was not Princess Taiping's real name. Chapter 53. As expected, Princess Taiping saw shock, appreciation, and a momentary intoxication in Yang Fan's eyes. She smiled, waiting for the pleasant surprise and thanks she had expected. However, his eyes only lasted for a moment before they became clear again. They were as clear and pure as the Luo River at the bottom of the riverbank. Everyone has their own aspirations. How can I force them? I like freedom and am used to being undisciplined. I really can't stand being bound by rules. I appreciate your kindness. Yang Fan didn't expose her identity. He just held up the waist token and respectfully returned it. The three women were a little surprised. The old woman suddenly understood and laughed. "You young man, you don't know how to read. Haha, do you know that the person in front of you is—" Yang Fan didn't let her continue. He made a deep bow and interrupted her. "Please return the polo. I don't dare to disturb your pleasure." The old woman was a little stunned. Her expression was a little embarrassed. Princess Taiping was surprised. She couldn't help but glance at him with interest. Just now, although her eyes were on Yang Fan, she didn't actually put Yang Fan in her eyes. There weren't many men that she could put in her eyes. Now that she looked carefully, she saw something different. Yang Fan's appearance was very handsome. He was so handsome that he looked like a girl. But Princess Taiping was able to sense something that ordinary people couldn't. The ridge of his nose and the edge between his tightly closed lips, his slightly thin but steady and spirited demeanor. Princess Taiping couldn't help but think of a man, the only man she loved. She remembered the first time she met him. He was wearing a short shirt with arrow sleeves. He walked down from the court. He talked and laughed calmly with a sunny face. At that time he was about this age and looked like this. That man had just starved to death in the prison of the Ministry of Justice last year. Princess Taiping felt miserable in her heart. She took a deep look at Yang Fan, raised her hand, and threw the red ball back. The red ball drew a red line in the air and accurately fell into Yang Fan's hand. Yang Fan took 3 steps back. He cupped his hands and turned to leave. Wait! Princess Taiping suddenly called out to him again. Yang Fan halted his steps and turned around. He asked respectfully, "May I know what other instructions does noble lady have?" Princess Taiping gently picked up a gold-painted wooden goblet, filled with grape wine, and slowly placed it into the Luo River beside her. The goblet flowed down the winding river until it reached Yang Fan's side. This was a game of persuading people to drink. They would admire the scenery near the river, dig a pond, and draw the water into the pond. Then they would place the wine cup in the water, and whoever it floated to, that person would drink the cup. Princess Taiping said sweetly, "Please have a drink." Yang Fan cupped his hands in salute to her, bent over to pick up the wooden goblet, and gulped down the entire goblet of wine. He cupped his fists and said, "Thank you." His smile was bright and radiant, as pure and radiant as the sunlight shining off the Luo River. The old woman looked at Yang Fan, who was leaving, and then looked at Princess Taiping, who was still staring at his back. She covered her mouth with her sleeve and smiled gently. "Does Ling Yue like that young Lang Jun?" This action was very elegant and playful. If it was done by a young and beautiful woman, it would be very charming. However, this old woman was too old. She even wanted to act like a little girl, which made her feel like she was making a fool of herself by imitating others. Princess Taiping didn't look at her. She just looked at the young man who was far away. She said lightly, "Although there are many teams of our Tang dynasty participating in the bow throwing competition every year, the Westerners always win. This year, there will be another competition. If this young man is trained well, maybe he can help our Tang dynasty win the championship." The old woman didn't believe it. She only thought that Princess Taiping didn't mean what she said. She slightly lowered her eyes and secretly made a plan in her mind. When Yang Fan returned to the court, a good show had already begun. The servants and maids gathered in a circle and looked up to see what was going on. Several noble women who accompanied Madame Yao had a faint smile on their faces. No matter how you looked at it, it seemed that they were taking pleasure in other people's misfortune. Yang Fan hurriedly separated the crowd and walked forward. When the servants saw that the star of the court had returned, they were very courteous. Yang Fan walked into the crowd and saw Tin Ano and Madame Yao standing face to face. Madame Yao was like a rooster who was fighting, angry, while Tin Ano smiled sweetly and looked calm. Lu Junfan was sandwiched between the two women like an angry little hen. His face was swollen and purple. No one knew what he was saying, but in fact he didn't say a word. Madame Yao angrily scolded, "You bitch! How dare you bully me like this? Do you know that I'm the one who provides for his food, clothing, and all his other expenses?" Xia Hoing said, "Lu Lang is handsome and talented. As long as he concentrates on his studies, he will definitely achieve great things in the future. From now on, with me helping him, he won't need to care about your feelings." Madame Yao sneered, "I'll use the leftover soup to cook it. If you like it, feel free to take it. I've long since hated this kind of dog material, but you treat it like a treasure." "Ha! The Liao slaves are indeed ignorant." Xiahou Ing said indifferently, "You don't need to provoke me with words. I won't lower myself to your level. In my eyes, you're no different from the slave who was trying out for marriage. There's no need to be angry at you." When Madame Yao heard this, her face immediately turned red. It turned out that when a great family in the western regions took a fancy to a man, they wouldn't marry him immediately. Usually, they would send 2 or 3 slaves to share a room with him. Only after the man was proven to have no hidden illness would they marry their daughter to him. Madame Yao said that Lu Junfan was a leftover soup, but Xiahou Ing mocked her for being a slave who was trying out for marriage. How could Madame Yao, who had always thought highly of herself, not be angry? Seeing that Xiahou Ing was pulling Lu Junfan away, Madame Yao immediately said to Lu Junfan in a stern voice, "Lu Junfan, you beggar, you murderous dog, if you follow her today, don't ever come to my door again." Lu Junfan's heart was wavering. If Xiahou Ing clearly expressed that she wanted to marry him, he would naturally follow her without hesitation. However, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. If he completely broke off relations with Madame Yao and Miss Xiahou refused to marry him, wouldn't both sides be in vain? As he was feeling apprehensive, Xiahou Ing proudly said, "With me, Lu Lang will be as rich and powerful as a marquis. Why do you need to live under someone else's roof?" Madame Yao angrily said, "Little slut! I'm going to die from anger. Wang Er, Fan Chi, slap her." Wang, Rufeng, and Fan Bin immediately rolled up their sleeves and were about to rush forward when Chu Kuanga's group immediately swarmed forward. He scowled and said, "Who has eaten the heart of a bear or the heart of a leopard to dare to be rude to my little wife?" Wang, Rufeng, Fan Bin, and the others already knew how powerful Chu Kuanga was. Seeing that the unfathomable ball god had also rushed back in time, they immediately became timid. Madame Yao had brought many servants, but there weren't many who could fight. On Xiahou Ying's side, other than the dull-witted servant girl Coer, everyone else was tall and strong. Comparing the two, it was obvious who was superior. There was no need to fight anymore. Seeing that her subordinates were hesitating and not daring to step forward, Madame Yao was so angry that she almost went crazy. She cursed. "First I raised an ingrate like Lu Junfan, then I raised a bunch of useless pigs and dogs. Instead of raising trash like you, I might as well raise an animal. Xiao Bei, bite her for me." Madame Yao pointed her finger at Xiahou Ing, and the lynx that had been snuggling next to her leg immediately bristled. It bared its sharp teeth and let out a heart-shaking roar, preparing to pounce at Xiahou Ing. Xiahou Ing made a sharp whistle with her fingers, and a terrifying roar came from the tent not far away. A pale yellow shadow darted out of the tent and shot towards Xiahou Ing like an arrow. It straightened its back and wagged its tail. It raised its head high and opened its mouth full of sharp teeth, letting out a loud roar. Its roar swept up a huge wave of air, causing the fur on the lynx's body to tremble. Standing behind the lynx, Madame Yao and a few female servants had their hair and clothes fluttering in the wind. In a panic, the maids and servants scattered. Madame Yao staggered 2 steps and stepped on her own skirt, causing her to fall flat on her back. The lynx called Xiao Bei let out a frightened whimper, then turned around and ran. It disappeared like a wisp of smoke, and in the darkness, it charged directly towards Princess Taiping's tent. Only then did everyone see that standing in front of Xiahou Ing was a cheetah. It was common for the people of Eastern Capital to see nobles riding hawks and dogs out of the city to hunt, but those who could afford to raise cheetahs were truly wealthy and noble families. Not many of them had seen one, and even when they did, it was only from afar. They had never seen one so close before. Now that such a large lynx was right in front of their eyes, everyone's expression changed, and no one went to help Madame Yao. Chapter 54. Xiahou Ing glanced at them with disdain and patted the cheetah's head. She grabbed Lu Junfan's arm and said, "Lu Lang, let's go." It was as if Lu Junfan had been cursed. His mind was in a daze, and his footsteps were as swift as a cloud as he followed Xiaohoang. He couldn't hear a single word of Madame Yao's vicious curses behind him. Although Madame Yao's mother was Princess Taiping's wet nurse, Miss Xiaoho was from a noble family in the western regions. Would Princess Taiping offend a noble family in the western regions for the lover of her wet nurse's daughter? Princess Taiping was undoubtedly the Empress' most beloved daughter, but she had never heard of her interfering in political affairs. Besides, Lu Junfan had followed Madame Yao for a long time. He clearly knew that her old mother, who had been Princess Taiping's wet nurse, was not necessarily favored by the princess. After all, Princess Taiping was already an adult and had long since married and had children. Her wet nurse when she was young, she could only use her name as a tiger skin to fool the people outside. By the time Madame Yao crawled up from the ground in a sorry state, Xiaohoang and her group had already left, leaving behind only a few servants who were dismantling the tent. Naturally, Lady Yao couldn't lower herself to flaunt her prowess in front of those lowly servants. Just as she was feeling extremely humiliated and had nowhere to vent her anger, that lynx came running back whimpering. With one of its legs limping, it jumped to Lady Yao's side and stuck close to her body. It raised its head and looked at her pitifully, whimpering as it begged for mercy. Madame Yao took a look and saw that her Xiaobei's front leg was still curled up, as if it had been injured. She looked in the direction that the lynx had escaped from and saw a large man in embroidered robes walking towards the tent with a stick in his hand. That was where the other tourists who were enjoying the autumn scenery were gathered. It turned out that the lynx had fled in fright and went straight for the tent. The guards of Princess Taiping's residence were afraid that it would scratch its master and beat it back with a stick. Madame Yao flew into a rage. She was so angry that she was about to go crazy. Today, everything was really going wrong. She stormed towards the tent and screamed from afar, "Which bastard injured my lynx? Come out now." A large man in embroidered robes came out and stood up. He loudly said, "I was the one who hurt your little beast. What are you going to do about it?" Madame Yao knelt down and touched the ground with her forehead. Her voice trembled as she said, "I didn't know the princess was here and offended your highness. Please forgive me, forgive me." She glanced around and was about to attack her master when she saw Princess Taiping's appearance. Last year, when Princess Taiping was 23 years old, she was fortunate enough to go to the Princess Palace with her mother to celebrate Princess Taiping's birthday. She had seen Princess Taiping's real appearance once. She had fawned over this noble person for half of her life. How could she forget her after seeing her once? Princess Taiping was a little surprised. She looked at her carefully, but she had no impression of her. She couldn't help but ask curiously, "You know me? Who are you?" Lady Yao replied with fear and trepidation, "I am the daughter of Madame Han Yao Yin. Last year, I accompanied my mother to the princess's mansion to celebrate Her Highness's birthday. I was fortunate enough to be summoned by the princess to see the princess, daughter of Madame Han Yao Yin'er." Princess Taiping tilted her head and thought for a while. She suddenly understood and nodded. "Yes, I remember now. So it's you. Just now, what happened?" Madame Yao hesitated and didn't dare to answer. Princess Taiping saw her stuttering appearance and associated it with the scene she had just seen. She could roughly guess what was going on. Her expression turned cold, and she slowly said, "What rank is your husband in? How dare you call yourself Madam?" Madam was not a title that anyone could call themselves. Only the wives of rank 5 and above imperial officials could call themselves Madam. How could Yao Yin or his husband be an official? Being asked by Princess Taiping, Yao Yin was even more frightened. She trembled and said, Yes, I am arrogant. I am guilty." Princess Taiping snorted and said, "I remember your mother said that your husband had passed away for a long time. Are you still living alone at home?" Yao Yin bowed and said, "Your Highness, Thank you for asking. My husband has passed away for many years. I have been living alone at home. Princess Taiping said lightly, In that case, you should find someone to marry so as not to make trouble outside. Madame Yao blushed and didn't dare to say anything. Princess Taiping waved her hand coldly. Madame Yao was relieved. She hurriedly bowed 3 times and left. When she returned to her tent with lingering fear, Xiahou Ying and others had disappeared. The place where they had set up their tent was as clean as a bone chewed by a dog. Madame Yao was humiliated in front of Xiahou Ying. When she vented her anger on others, she ran into Princess Taiping and lost face in front of her female companion. She was so ashamed that she didn't have the mood to continue her sightseeing. She hastily packed up her tent and returned to Yongkong Lane in disgrace. After returning to Yongkong Lane, Madame Yao didn't go back to her home first. She went to Lu Juanfan's house angrily. Lu Juanfan's father was originally a small official in Luoyang. Before Empress Wu made Luoyang the administrative center of the whole Tang dynasty, he had bought a house here. At that time, the property in Luoyang was much cheaper than now, so the house he bought was not small. It was just that after her parents passed away, the family declined. Before she managed to climb onto Madame Yao's thigh, Lu Junfan had been living off her savings and had pawned everything that she could. As a result, there was only an empty shell left in the family. Madame Yao angrily barged into Lu Junfan's house. She sat in the hall for a long time, but she still didn't see him come back. The anger in her heart burned even more, so she ordered her servants to smash the Lu house inside and out. Only then did her anger slightly dissipate, and she angrily returned to the house. At this time, Lu Junfan was at Xiahou Ying's house. The door of the house Xiahou Ying rented was facing the main street, not inside the lane. Lu Junfan was a discerning person. With one look, he knew that this was the house of an official of the imperial court above the 3rd rank. This was because it was impossible for the house of an official below the 3rd rank to directly face the main street. Xiahou Ying briefly explained to him that this was indeed the house of a minister. At that time, most of the officials in the capital had mansions in the capital. When they retired or were sent to other places to be officials, the empty mansions would be rented out. Or when there were too many mansions, the empty mansions would be rented out to guests. In the early Tang dynasty, most of the high-ranking officials and nobles in the capital would do this. Because the inn industry was not yet developed, guests of status who came to the capital to stay for a long time found it inconvenient to live in simple inns. So they rented the extra mansions of the high-ranking officials and nobles. Of course, the more extravagant the guest, the larger and higher the grade of the mansions they rented. After the golden hairpin drunken wine, the slave competition by the Luo River, and the pet leopard that only first-rate nobles would keep, Lu Junfan no longer doubted Xiahou Ying's identity. Now that he saw that the mansion she rented was so extravagant and noble, even though it was only a temporary rental, there were many servants and servants in the mansion, and the daily expenses were more than 1,000 taels of gold. He had no more doubts about Xiahou Ying's identity. Lu Junfan followed Xiahou Ying out of the light carriage. As soon as they entered the mansion, pretty maids welcomed them. When they entered the courtyard, they saw heavy doors and a few winding corridors. When they entered the back of the mansion and entered the main hall, they saw bead curtains hanging low, a picture screen standing solemnly, and the furnishings in the room were all luxurious. Miss Xiahou went inside to change her clothes. When she came out again, she was wearing a dazzling embroidered gown with pearls swaying in the wind. She was graceful and charming, like a fairy from heaven. Xiahou Ying ordered the servants to prepare a banquet to entertain her Lang Jun. With just one order, the 8 delicacies of the land and water were laid out one by one. There were also several beautiful maids who sang and danced to liven things up. Lu Junfan had never seen such an extravagance before. With a beauty by his side, tenderness, hundreds of charming dancers, and melodious singing, he unknowingly became tipsy. When his eyes were drowsy, he vaguely heard Miss Xiaoho confiding in his ear. She said that when his father and brother returned from Yangzhou, she would tell her father that they were destined to be married, and they would live together forever. Lu Junfan was captivated by her beauty and agreed without saying anything. When he was dead drunk, he was helped down by the pretty maids and rested in the guest room of the minister's mansion. When he woke up, it was already the morning of the next day. The sun was high in the sky. Lu Junfan opened his eyes and saw that the embroidered bed was like smoke. When he breathed in, a fragrant scent assailed his nostrils. When he reached out to touch it, the silk on the bed was as smooth as fat. His only regret was that he did not have a naked beauty by his side. Otherwise, this place would be heaven.